I had been planning this hike for months. A remote trail deep in the mountains, far from any crowded national parks or tourist-friendly spots. Just me, nature, and the quiet isolation that I had been craving. The idea was to spend 3 days on the trail, carrying everything I needed in my pack and testing myself against the wild. I arrived at the trailhead just after dawn, the morning air crisp and cool. My car was the only one in the gravel lot. The ranger station was closed, which wasn't surprising this early in the season. A laminated sign nailed to a post warned about trail conditions and the importance of bringing enough supplies. I double-checked my gear, plenty of water, a solid first aid kit, extra food. My boots were broken in, my pack sat comfortably on my shoulders, and my map was folded neatly in my jacket pocket. The first few miles were perfect. The trail wound through towering pines, the ground soft underfoot with a layer of old needles. Birds chirped somewhere overhead, the only sound besides my steady footsteps. I took deep breaths, letting the clean air fill my lungs. This was what I had needed. No emails, no phone calls, no distractions. Just me and the trail. By midday, I reached a small clearing and decided to take a break. I dropped my pack and sat on a fallen log, drinking water and eating a protein bar. A slight breeze rustled the trees, and I closed my eyes for a moment, soaking it all in. When I opened them again, I noticed something odd. There was a boot print in the dirt, just off the trail. It wasn't mine. The tread was different, and it looked fresher than any of my own prints. But I hadn't passed anyone, and I hadn't seen another car at the trailhead. I told myself it was probably from a hiker the day before, but something about it put me on edge. I finished my break and pressed on, keeping an eye on the trail ahead. The trees grew denser as I climbed higher into the mountains, and the temperature dropped slightly. I told myself to shake off the uneasy feeling. I had done solo hikes before, and I knew my mind could play tricks on me. Still, every so often, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder. By late afternoon, I reached the spot I had planned to camp for the night. It was a small clearing near a creek, just off the main trail. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and got a small fire going as the sun dipped below the tree line. The sound of the creek was soothing, and I finally felt myself relax again. As darkness fell, I cooked a quick meal on my camp stove, then sat by the fire, enjoying the quiet. But that feeling from earlier hadn't quite left me. It was something just at the edge of my awareness, like the way your skin prickles when you think someone is watching you. I shook my head, annoyed at myself. I was alone out here, and I needed to stop letting my imagination get the best of me. I climbed into my tent, zipping it up tight. The fire outside cast flickering shadows against the thin fabric. I lay there, listening to the wind through the trees and the distant rush of the creek. Eventually, I drifted off. I woke up to a noise. It was subtle, but distinct, twigs snapping, the shuffle of movement. I held my breath, listening. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but something felt off. It was close. I reached for my flashlight, clicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the thin nylon walls of my tent. The sound had stopped. I stayed still, heart pounding, waiting. Then, from just outside the tent, another crunch of leaves. I sat up, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? But there had been no signs of wildlife large enough to be dangerous. I had hung my food far from camp, so nothing should be sniffing around. Slowly, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim glow. The woods were silent. I swept the flashlight around, but there was nothing there, just trees and darkness. I listened for a while longer, but the sound didn't come back. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been an animal after all. I zipped the tent back up and tried to sleep, but it was a long, restless night. Morning came, and with the daylight, my fear seemed foolish. I broke down camp quickly, eager to get moving. I planned to cover a lot of ground today, pushing deeper into the mountains. A few miles in, I noticed something strange. A piece of fabric snagged on a tree branch, fluttering in the breeze. Blue like denim. I walked closer and plucked it off, turning it over in my hands. It looked like it had been torn from a jacket. I scanned the forest around me. No signs of anyone.
No voices, no distant footsteps.
I stuffed the fabric into my pocket and kept going, telling myself not to dwell on it. But as I hiked, I started seeing more. A rusted canteen, half buried under fallen leaves. A single sock, damp and dirty. A torn strap from a backpack. None of it was fresh. The fabric was faded. The canteen weathered. Maybe someone had camped out here a long time ago and left things behind. That would make sense. But as I kept going, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. By late afternoon, I reached a fork in the trail. My map showed that the left path led toward a ridge with a good camping spot. The right path wasn't marked. I stared at it, wondering why it wasn't on the map. It looked well-trodden, though, like people had used it before. I took a step toward the left path, then stopped. Footprints. Dozens of them leading down the unmarked path. And not just old ones. Some looked fresh. I stood there, my skin crawling. Who else was out here? I hadn't seen a single soul. The rational part of my brain told me it was nothing. Just an old trail not listed on my map. Maybe hunters or backcountry hikers used it. But another part of me, the part that had been on edge since yesterday, was screaming to turn around. I listened. I turned back, heading the way I had come. I hiked fast, ignoring my aching legs. I wanted out of these woods before nightfall. The whole time I felt watched. The silence pressed in heavier than before. When I finally reached the trailhead, my car was still the only one in the lot. I threw my pack in the back and got in, locking the doors out of instinct. My hands shook as I turned the key in the ignition. As I pulled out onto the dirt road, I saw something in my rearview mirror. A figure standing just at the tree line, half hidden in the shadows. Watching, I didn't slow down. I never went back to that trail again. I don't even know why I'm writing this down. Maybe to remind myself, maybe to warn someone else, or maybe just to make sense of it all. I've spent a lot of time trying to convince myself it didn't happen the way I remember it, but no matter how many times I go over it in my head, the details don't change. It happened. It was supposed to be a simple hike. I'd done harder ones before. This was just a solo overnight trip, nothing crazy. I'd picked a trail that wasn't too remote, something well-marked, a loop that would bring me right back to my car the next morning. The whole thing was just under 12 miles. Easy, a way to clear my head. I started late in the morning, figuring I'd hike about 8 miles in, set up camp, and then finish the last 4 miles back to my car the next day. The weather was perfect. Cool, crisp air. Late fall. The leaves had mostly fallen, carpeting the ground in orange and brown. Everything smelled like damp earth and wood. There was no one else on the trail, just me. I liked it that way. The first few miles were easy. The path was well maintained, not too steep. Birds were chirping, squirrels darted through the trees. The occasional gust of wind rustled the branches above. I took my time, enjoying the quiet, stopping every so often to take a sip from my water bottle or adjust my pack. Around mile 5, things started to feel off. I can't explain it. The trees felt closer together. The air was still. No more wind, no more birds, just my own footsteps crunching on the leaves. I told myself it was normal, that I was imagining things, but the feeling didn't go away. I kept walking. At mile 6, I saw something strange. A shoe, just one. A hiking boot sitting right in the middle of the trail. It looked new. No scuffs, no dirt, just sitting there. I slowed down, looking around, expecting to see someone nearby. No one, no sound, just trees. I kept moving, but the unease stuck with me. A few 100 feet later, I saw something else. A jacket, a child's jacket, faded red, draped over a low-hanging branch. It looked like it had been there a while. I didn't touch it. I kept moving. My stomach was tight. My brain was trying to come up with logical explanations. People lose things on hikes all the time, right? Mile 7. That's when I noticed the silence. Not just quiet, true silence. No wind, no animals. Not even the sound of my own footsteps seemed right. Everything felt muffled. Then I saw the backpack, off the trail about 10 feet into the trees. It was sitting upright, leaning against the base of a tree. I don't know why I walked toward it. I should have left it alone, should have turned around, but I didn't. I took slow steps toward it, looking around, expecting someone to call out to claim it. Nothing. I crouched down and touched the strap. It was dry. I unzipped the main compartment. Inside, there was a water bottle half full, a granola bar, unopened, a flashlight, a phone. I picked up the phone. The screen was dark. I pressed the power button. Dead. I looked around again. My breathing felt too loud. The trees felt too close. The sky dimmer than it should have been. Something wasn't right. I stood up, gripping the phone in my hand. I had to decide. Keep going? Turn around? I should have turned around. But I was only a mile from where I planned to camp. I told myself I'd make it there, set up, and leave first thing in the morning. Mile 8, I found the clearing. The trees opened up to a small flat area with just enough space for my tent. I forced myself to go through the motions, set up my tent, unroll my sleeping bag, gather some wood for a fire. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched. I kept telling myself I was just spooked from finding the backpack, that my mind was playing tricks on me. The sun went down fast. The second it disappeared, the cold set in. I lit a fire, ate a protein bar, forced myself to drink water. I checked my phone. No signal. I tried not to think about the phone I'd found in the backpack. It was still in my pack, tucked away at the bottom, like I could pretend it wasn't there. The forest was still. No wind, no insects, just silence. I don't know what time it was when I heard the first sound. A crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves. My whole body went rigid. I held my breath. Another crunch. Closer. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees. Nothing. I forced myself to breathe. Probably an animal, I told myself. A deer. A raccoon. Something harmless. I turned off the flashlight, climbed into my tent, zipped it up. I lay there, eyes open, listening. Another crunch. Closer. I gripped my knife. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Silence. Then a whisper, right outside my tent. I don't know what it said. I don't want to know. I stayed frozen. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. Then the tent moved, just slightly, like something had brushed against it. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent just enough to shine the light outside. Nothing. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. An hour. Nothing. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I woke up to the sound of something breathing. Slow. Deep. Right outside my tent. I didn't move. Didn't even blink. Then, just as slow, just as deep, it exhaled. I grabbed my knife, my flashlight, my pack. I unzipped the tent in one motion and lunged out, flashlight swinging. Nothing. The fire had burned down to embers. The forest was still. The air was freezing. I didn't pack up my tent. Didn't stop to think. I just ran. I ran the whole way back. 8 miles in the dark. My legs burned. My lungs ached. I didn't stop. When I reached my car, the sun was just starting to rise. I threw my pack inside, locked the doors, and drove. I didn't look back. When I got home, I pulled out the phone I had found. I plugged it in. The screen lit up. A picture of a man and a woman on the lock screen, smiling, arms around each other. A notification popped up. Missed call, Mom. I called the number. It went straight to voicemail. I turned off the phone. I don't know what happened out there. I don't want to know. I never went back. I set out early that morning alone, just how I liked it. The forest was dense, the kind where the trees grow too close together, their trunks thick and rough, reaching high enough to blot out most of the sky. It was quiet out there, just the sound of my boots crunching over dried leaves and the occasional bird overhead. It was perfect. The trail I picked was old, not a marked one, just a path that had been worn down by deer and maybe a few hikers before me. I liked finding places that people didn't go too often. Felt like real hiking, not just a walk in the woods. I had packed light, just a small backpack with some water, snacks, a map, and my knife, like always. The deeper I went, the more it felt like I had stepped into something forgotten. The air was damp, thick with the scent of earth and old wood. The trees seemed older here, their bark peeling in long strips. A few fallen ones stretched across the path, their wood soft and crumbling. I climbed over them, not thinking much of it, just nature doing its thing. After about 3 hours, I started noticing something strange. The path had been narrow before, but now it felt almost closed in. Branches reached inward like they were trying to touch me. The underbrush was thicker, the kind that snagged at my pants and scratched my arms when I pushed through. I kept going, though. That was the whole point, to get away from everything. Then I smelled it. It wasn't the usual damp earth and leaves. It was something sharp, something rotten, like meat left out in the sun too long. At first, I thought maybe it was a dead animal nearby. That happens sometimes. A deer dying out in the woods, nature taking its course. But the smell didn't fade. It got stronger. I walked a little further, stepping carefully now, my senses sharper. The smell wasn't just lingering in one place. It was following me, or maybe I was walking deeper into it. I stopped, listened. Nothing. No birds, no wind through the trees. Nothing. Just my own breathing. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees, the ground, everything. That's when I saw it. Pile. At first, it just looked like a mess of leaves and branches, like something had fallen and decayed. But when I stepped closer, I saw what it really was: bones. A lot of them, not fresh but not old enough to be completely clean either. They were scattered, some half buried under dirt and leaves, others piled together. Some still had bits of dried flesh clinging to them. And there was something else, something metal, catching the weak sunlight through the trees. I crouched and pulled it out. A knife, not mine. A hunting knife, the blade dull with rust. The handle looked like it had been wrapped in duct tape. I felt the air change then, the kind of change you feel in your gut before a storm hits. I stood up fast, gripping the knife. I wasn't alone out there. Something cracked in the woods. Not a branch breaking under an animal's foot. Something bigger. I turned toward the sound, heart hammering in my chest. The trees were too thick to see far, but I knew something was there, watching. I took a slow step back, then another, then I ran. Not the kind of run where you're pacing yourself for a long trail. The kind of run where your body moves before your brain tells it to. I didn't stop to check my map, didn't think about which way I was going. I just knew I had to get away. The smell stayed with me, thick and choking. The sound of something moving behind me, keeping pace. I ran until my legs burned, until my breath came in sharp, painful gasps. I had no idea how far I'd gone. I only stopped when I tripped, my foot catching on a root. I hit the ground hard, the impact jolting through my body. My hands scraped against the dirt and leaves, and my backpack shifted, the contents spilling out. I pushed myself up, dizzy, heart pounding. Then I saw it. A boot, not mine. Not an old, abandoned boot left behind by some careless hiker. A boot with a foot still inside it. I scrambled backward, my mind barely processing what I was seeing. More bones, more torn clothing, half buried in the earth. This wasn't just a pile of dead animals. I wasn't supposed to be here. I grabbed my backpack, shoved what I could inside without taking my eyes off the ground in front of me, and stood up. I forced myself to slow my breathing, to listen. The forest was silent again. Too silent. Then movement. Close. Too close. I ran again. This time I focused. I tried to remember the way I had come, but everything looked different. The trees were too thick, the underbrush too tangled. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I didn't stop. I could hear it behind me now. Something moving, fast. I broke through a clearing, my footing unsteady as I slid down a small incline. My knees hit the dirt hard, but I pushed forward. And then, finally, I saw it. The road, a narrow, cracked strip of pavement, barely wide enough for a car. I didn't stop running until my feet hit the asphalt. Only then did I dare to look back. The forest was still. Nothing moved. No sign of anyone or anything. Just trees and shadows. I stood there for what felt like forever, my chest heaving, my body trembling. Then, slowly, I started walking. I didn't stop until I was back at my truck, parked miles down the road. When I finally sat inside, locking the doors, I realized I was still clutching the rusted knife. My hands were shaking too hard to let go. I never went back to that trail. I never told anyone what I saw. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I still smell it. That sharp, rotting smell, like something waiting, watching. I always liked hiking alone. It gave me time to think, clear my head, and just be in nature without any distractions. I had done plenty of trails on my own before, so I didn't think twice when I planned a weekend hike deep in the mountains. The weather was supposed to be perfect, cool but not too cold, with clear skies. I packed my gear, enough food for a couple of days, water, a knife, a lighter, and a small tent. I didn't bring a gun, even though part of me knew I should have. I figured a knife would be enough for any small animals I might run into. That was my first mistake. The trail I chose wasn't one of the popular ones. It was deep in the woods, barely marked on most maps. That was exactly what I wanted, something isolated. I drove out early in the morning, parked my car at the small, empty lot near the start of the trail, and started my hike. The first few miles were peaceful. The trees stretched high above me, their branches barely swaying in the breeze. Birds chirped, and the crunch of my boots on the dirt was the only other sound. Felt good to be away from everything. After about 4 hours of hiking, I stopped to take a break. I drank some water, ate a protein bar, and checked my GPS. I was making good time. My plan was to reach a small clearing by sunset, set up camp, and head back the next morning. I had read online that the clearing had a great view of the valley below. I wanted to see it for myself. Another 2 hours passed, and I started to get the feeling that something was off. I couldn't explain it, but the woods had gone quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just dead silence. If you've spent enough time outdoors, you know that silence in the woods usually means something is nearby. Maybe a predator. I tried to shake it off and kept walking, but I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. I wasn't sure why. The sun started dipping lower, and I knew I had to find the clearing soon. I checked my GPS again, but the signal was weak. The dot on the screen showed I was close, so I kept going. But the trees never thinned out. The trail seemed to twist in ways I didn't recognize. I had followed the map exactly, but nothing looked right. I should have reached the clearing by now. Then I saw something ahead. A small wooden structure half hidden by the trees. My stomach tightened. There wasn't supposed to be anything out here. No cabins, no old ranger stations, nothing. But there it was, standing in the middle of the woods like it had been there for decades. The wood was dark and rotting, the roof partially caved in. I walked closer, slowly, gripping my knife even though I wasn't sure why I felt the need to. The door was missing, and inside, I could see a pile of broken furniture and debris. I wasn't sure if I should go in. My gut told me to keep moving, but my curiosity got the better of me. I stepped inside, my boots crunching on the dirt-covered floor. The air smelled stale, like damp wood and decay. There were old cans scattered around, a rusted lantern, and what looked like a makeshift bed in the corner. Someone had lived here once. Recently? Couldn't tell. But I knew I didn't want to stick around long enough to find out. As I turned to leave, I noticed something carved into the wall near the doorway. It wasn't words, just a series of deep, jagged marks. Scratches, almost like someone had clawed at the wood. My stomach turned, and I stepped out of the cabin fast, glancing around the woods. Still silent, still empty, but I didn't feel alone. I picked up my pace. The clearing had to be close. I just needed to find it, set up camp, and get some rest. I told myself I was just overthinking things, that the old cabin was just some forgotten hunting shelter. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something, that I wasn't supposed to see it. It got dark faster than I expected. I should have reached the clearing by now, but the trees just kept stretching on. My GPS was useless, my phone had no signal, and my headlamp barely cut through the thick blackness of the woods. I decided to stop and set up camp right where I was. Hiking in the dark was a bad idea. I found a relatively flat spot near the trail, set up my tent, and crawled inside. I forced myself to eat even though I wasn't hungry, then lay down and listened. Still nothing. No wind, no insects, just dead silence. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I woke up to the sound of something moving outside my tent. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Not an animal. Too heavy. My chest tightened, and I reached for my knife, gripping the handle so tight my hand ached. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I held my breath, listening. Then, slowly, the zipper of my tent started to move. Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I slashed at the fabric with my knife, tearing a wide gash in the side of the tent. I scrambled out, heart pounding, swinging my headlamp in every direction. But there was nothing there. No footsteps leading up to my tent. No sign of anyone. Just trees and darkness. I didn't stay. I grabbed my pack, left my tent behind, and started walking. Fast. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just needed to go downhill, get back to my car, and get out of these woods. My headlamp flickered, and I cursed, smacking it to keep it from going out. I was moving so fast that I nearly tripped over something on the ground. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what it was. A backpack. Not mine. Old, covered in dirt, the fabric torn in places. It had been there a long time. Too long. I didn't stop to look. I kept moving. The fear in my gut was almost unbearable now. Something was wrong with these woods. I walked for what felt like hours, ignoring the burning in my legs, ignoring the way my skin crawled with the feeling of being watched. And then, finally, I saw the glint of my car's headlights in the distance. I ran. I didn't look back. I threw myself into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and started the engine with shaking hands. The headlights illuminated the trailhead, the trees standing tall and unmoving. There was nothing there, just woods. I drove away, not stopping until I was miles down the road. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. There were no ghosts,
No monsters.
but something or someone had been out there with me. I don't know if it was a person living in those woods or something else, something worse. I don't want to know. I haven't been hiking alone since. I had been planning this hike for weeks. The trail was deep in the mountains, far from any town or cell service, just the way I liked it. The trip was meant to be a challenge, solo, a full day of hiking in, setting up camp, and a day hiking back out. It wasn't my first time doing this kind of trip, but it would be the most remote hike I'd done alone. The idea of being that deep into nature excited me. I got to the trailhead early in the morning, my pack full of supplies, a tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a first aid kit, and a few other essentials. The first few miles were easy, the trail well marked, winding through tall pines. The morning sun filtered through the branches, casting golden light on the forest floor. Everything smelled fresh, pine needles, damp earth, and the crisp mountain air. As I got deeper into the wilderness, the trail became more rugged. The dirt path turned rocky, and the incline became steeper. I paced myself, taking occasional sips from my water bottle. Hours passed, and the terrain grew wilder. There were no signs of other hikers, which was exactly what I had hoped for. The farther I went, the more isolated I felt. No distant hum of cars, no voices, just the sound of my boots crunching over dirt and stones, the occasional rustle of an unseen animal in the brush. Around midday, I reached a clearing and stopped for lunch. I sat on a fallen log, pulling out a protein bar and some dried fruit from my pack. The view was incredible. A vast valley below, dense with trees, and beyond that, distant mountain peaks stretching across the horizon. It was then that I noticed something odd. The forest had gone quiet. No birds, no wind in the trees, nothing. Just silence. I shrugged it off, convincing myself that I was just noticing it because I had stopped moving. I finished eating, brushed the crumbs off my lap, and continued on. The trail became harder to follow as I climbed higher. It was less maintained up here, overgrown in places with fallen branches and loose rocks scattered across the path. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, the warm golden light turning cooler, shadows stretching long across the ground. I checked my map and compass, making sure I was on the right path. Everything checked out, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then, I found the first sign that I wasn't alone. A footprint, not mine, in the dirt. It was fresh. The edges were sharp, not softened by wind or time. It was a hiking boot print similar to mine but slightly larger. I looked around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. Maybe another hiker had passed through earlier in the day. Still, something about it made me uneasy. I kept moving, picking up my pace slightly. As I went on, I found more footprints always ahead of me, following the same trail. I wasn't sure if I was catching up to someone or if they had taken a different route further ahead. Either way, I decided to keep my distance. The sun was beginning to set when I found a suitable place to camp, a flat clearing surrounded by thick trees. I set up my tent, started a small fire, and boiled some water for my dehydrated meal. The warmth of the fire and the act of preparing food helped ease my nerves. The footprints had unsettled me, but I reminded myself that people hiked this area. I wasn't truly alone out here. As darkness settled, the forest came alive with the sounds of nocturnal animals. I sat by the fire, listening to the distant hoot of an owl, the chirping of insects. It was peaceful. After a while, I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and settled into my sleeping bag. The night was cold, but exhaustion from the day's hike pulled me into sleep quickly. Sometime in the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint glow outside the tent. I listened, straining my ears. Then I heard it, a faint crunching sound. Footsteps. They weren't close, but they weren't far either. Slow, deliberate, moving just outside the clearing. I held my breath, heart pounding in my chest. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. The footsteps stopped. The forest was still again. I stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, every muscle tense, waiting. But nothing happened. No more sounds, no movement. Eventually, I convinced myself it could have been an animal and forced myself to lie back down. Sleep didn't come easily, but exhaustion won again. Morning arrived with the first light creeping through the trees. I stepped outside, stretching my sore limbs. Then I saw them, more footprints. They circled my campsite. I felt a wave of cold fear wash over me. These weren't my tracks. Someone had walked around my tent while I slept. I scanned the area, my mind racing. Whoever had been out here was gone now, but they had been close, watching. I packed up quickly, deciding to cut the trip short and head back. The way back felt different. The forest, once peaceful, now felt oppressive. Every sound put me on edge. I walked fast, checking over my shoulder constantly. 2 hours into the hike back, I found something that stopped me in my tracks. A tree right by the trail with something carved into it. For deep slashes, fresh, the exposed would still pale against the bark. I didn't wait to think about it. I moved faster, nearly jogging down the mountain, fueled by pure adrenaline. The entire way down, I felt watched. I made it back to my car just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the door, threw my pack inside, and got in. I didn't waste a second before starting the engine and peeling out of there. I don't know who was out there with me. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know one thing. I won't be going back to that trail again. I don't know why I decided to hike alone that day. Maybe I needed space, maybe I needed to clear my head, or maybe I was just being stubborn. Whatever the reason, it was a mistake. The trail was deep in the mountains, far from any town. It wasn't an official hiking route, but a path I had found on an old map, winding through dense forest and up to a ridge with what looked like an incredible view. I had prepared extra water, food, a knife, and a first aid kit. I had my GPS, but no signal. I figured I would just follow the trail and turn back before dark. I told myself it was safe. It was quiet when I started. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched. The trees were thick, towering, branches tangled together like skeletal fingers. The ground was uneven, roots twisting up like they wanted to trip me. I stepped carefully, trying not to make too much noise. For the first few miles, everything felt normal. Birds chirped, insects buzzed. I could hear my own breathing, my own footsteps crunching over dried leaves and loose dirt. But after a while, I noticed something strange. The sounds started fading. The birds stopped. The wind barely moved the trees. The only sound left was my footsteps, and even those seemed too loud. I told myself I was being paranoid. That's what happens when you're alone in the woods. Your mind plays tricks on you. I kept moving. Then I saw the footprints. They weren't mine. I stopped and looked down. They were fresh, leading in the same direction I was heading. The prints were deep, heavier than my own. Someone had passed through recently, but I hadn't seen a soul since I started. I swallowed hard and kept walking. Maybe it was a hunter. Maybe another hiker who knew about this trail. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. An hour later, I found something else. A backpack, torn open, lying just off the trail, half buried in leaves. It was old, faded red, the zipper's broken. I nudged it with my boot and saw something that made my stomach twist. A shirt, blood-stained. It wasn't soaked, but the dark brown patches were unmistakable. I crouched down, my heart hammering, and reached out to touch the fabric. It was dry, old. I tried to convince myself it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe an animal had dragged it here. Maybe it wasn't even human blood. I stood up fast, my hands clammy. The air felt thick, heavy in my lungs. I needed to turn back. My gut told me to leave, but I had come so far, and the ridge wasn't that much farther. I just needed to see it, take a picture, and then I'd go. I'd be fast. I pressed on, walking quicker now. The silence was suffocating. My own breathing felt too loud. My footsteps felt wrong, like they were disturbing something that didn't want to be disturbed. And then I smelled it. Rot. The thick, choking stench of something dead. It hit me all at once, making my eyes water. I gagged, pulling my shirt over my nose, but it barely helped. It was close, whatever it was. I should have turned around. I should have left, but I didn't. I kept walking, and that's when I saw it. A deer carcass. It was fresh, torn open, ribs jutting out, the meat stripped in jagged chunks. Flies swarmed, the sound of their wings the only thing breaking the silence. But that wasn't what made me freeze. It was the way it was cut. Not by teeth, not by claws, by something sharp. A knife. The cuts were clean, precise. Too precise for an animal. Someone had done this. Recently. I backed away slowly, my hands shaking. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Maybe a hunter? But why leave it like this? Why not take the meat? Why just leave it? I turned around, and that's when I heard it. Footsteps, not mine. Someone was behind me. I didn't think. I ran. The trail blurred around me, branches whipping my face, my breath coming in short gasps. My pack bounced against my back. I didn't know if they were chasing me. I didn't look. I just ran. I ran until my legs burned, until my lungs screamed. I tripped once, my knee slamming into a rock, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. I pushed forward, heart pounding, vision swimming. And then I saw it, the ridge. The clearing opened up, sunlight spilling through, the valley stretching below. But I didn't stop to admire it. I needed to find a way down, a faster way back. That's when I heard it again. Closer this time. Slow. Deliberate. I turned, finally forcing myself to look. And I saw him, a man, standing just at the tree line, half hidden in the shadows. His clothes were dirty, ragged. His face was hollow, sunken. He just stood there, watching me. He didn't move, didn't speak. I took a step back. He smiled, and then he stepped forward. I ran again, tearing through the brush, branches clawing at me. My knee throbbed, my lungs burned, but I didn't stop. I ran until I found the trail again, until I saw the marker where I had started. My car was just beyond the trees. I fumbled for my keys, yanked the door open, and threw myself inside. The engine roared to life and I slammed the locks shut. I didn't look back. I didn't breathe until I was miles away. When I finally stopped at a gas station, hands still shaking, I checked my GPS. The trail I had followed, it wasn't on the map anymore, like it had never been there at all. I had been planning this solo hiking trip for months. The trail deep in the North Cascades was remote, tough, and barely maintained. Exactly what I was looking for. I wanted a challenge, something to push my limits. I'd done plenty of hikes before, some dangerous, but this one felt different. Maybe it was the isolation, maybe the length, 4 days in and out, but I was ready, or so I thought. The morning I set out, the air was crisp. The sky was overcast, but there was no sign of rain. My pack was heavy, but nothing I couldn't handle. The first miles were smooth, the trail winding through dense evergreens, the ground damp but solid. Birds chirped. The occasional rustle of squirrels in the underbrush kept me company. It was peaceful, almost meditative. The first day went by without issue. I set up camp by a small creek, cooked a quick meal, and lay in my tent listening to the water. There was something calming about the sound, and I fell asleep quickly. The second day, things started to feel off. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just small things. The trail seemed rougher than I expected, as if fewer people had traveled it recently. Some parts looked washed out. A few times I had to stop and backtrack to find the right path. Nothing major, but enough to slow me down. Then there was the silence. The birds that had been so lively yesterday were gone. No rustling, no wind through the trees. Just me and my footsteps on the dirt. I told myself it was normal. Maybe the weather had shifted, or I was at an elevation where fewer animals lived. I pushed the thought away and kept walking. By late afternoon, I found an old sign, barely legible. Something about a former ranger station ahead. I hadn't read about it in my research, but it made sense. Remote areas often had abandoned structures. It was getting late, and I decided I'd push a bit further to see if it was still standing. If it was, it might make a good place to camp. When I found it, the station was more of a cabin than anything official. The wood was dark with age, the windows boarded up. A rusted metal sign hung crookedly over the door, unreadable from years of decay. The whole thing had an uneasy feel to it, but I was exhausted and didn't want to keep hiking in the dark. I checked the door. Locked. I walked around the back and found a broken window, big enough to climb through. Inside, it smelled of damp wood and mildew. Dust covered everything. An old desk sat against the far wall. A single chair toppled over beside it. Shelves with rotting papers, a small stove, a bunk with a filthy mattress. No signs of animals, which was odd. Usually, places like this got taken over by rodents. I set up my gear, ate a protein bar, and lay down, staring at the ceiling. It was dead silent. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I woke up suddenly, heart pounding. It was pitch black. I reached for my headlamp, flicked it on, and scanned the room. Nothing. I listened. No wind, no rain, no sounds at all. Just my own breathing. Then I heard it. Not a footstep, not an animal, just breathing. I held my breath. It wasn't mine. It was slow, deep, and close. My headlamp flickered, then went out. Panic shot through me. I fumbled for my flashlight, hand shaking. When I turned it on, the room was empty. My pack was where I left it, the door still shut, window intact. But the chair, the one that had been toppled over when I arrived, was now upright. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I grabbed my gear and got out. I didn't even eat. I just started walking, faster than I ever had before. Every step I felt watched. Every sound, every creak, every snap of a twig sent a jolt through my body. The trail felt different. I know it sounds crazy, but it didn't look the same as when I came in. The trees seemed closer together. The incline felt steeper. I checked my map, my GPS, but they both said I was on the right path. Still, something wasn't right. By midday, I should have reached a familiar marker. A fallen tree that had been split by lightning, something I distinctly remembered passing on my way in. But it wasn't there. I kept moving, trying not to think about it. Then I saw something that stopped me cold. Boot prints. Not mine. Someone else's. Fresh. Going in the same direction. I wasn't alone. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. There shouldn't have been anyone else out here. Not on this trail. I would have seen them on the way in. But these prints were fresh. Like they had just been made. I picked up my pace. Kept moving. I didn't stop for food. I barely stopped for water. I just wanted out. By late afternoon, I knew I was close to the trailhead. But the prints, they were still ahead of me. Still fresh. Then they stopped. Right in the middle of the trail. No turnoff, no side path. Just stopped. Like whoever made them had vanished. I ran. I don't care how stupid it sounds. I ran as fast as I could. My pack bounced against my back. My legs burned, but I didn't stop until I saw my car. I threw my pack in, locked the doors, and sat there, hands gripping the wheel, breathing hard. I didn't look back. I didn't take one last glance at the tree line. I just turned the key and got the hell out of there. I don't know what happened. Maybe I got turned around. Maybe the silence, the isolation, messed with my head. But I've hiked all my life, and I have never felt like that before. I still can't explain the footprints, or the breathing, and I don't think I ever want to. I parked my truck at the trailhead just as the sun was starting to rise. The sky was a soft pink, the air crisp and cool. It was the perfect morning for a long hike. The plan was simple: follow the main trail up the ridge, take in the view at the summit, then loop back down before dark. I had my backpack with enough supplies: water, snacks, a first aid kit, and my GPS. Everything was set. The first few miles were easy. The dirt path wound through thick trees, the scent of pine filling the air. I could hear birds waking up, calling to each other in short bursts. The forest felt alive but peaceful. The trail climbed gradually, and after about an hour, I reached a clearing where I could see the valley below. The sight was stunning. Rolling hills stretching far into the distance, morning mist still clinging to the low spots. I took a quick drink, adjusted my pack, and kept going. The trail got steeper. The trees thinned out, replaced by jagged rocks and patches of dry grass. I had to be more careful where I stepped. Loose stones shifted under my boots. I paced myself, focusing on each step. The wind picked up as I gained elevation, whistling through the gaps in the rock formations. There were no other hikers around. It felt like I had the whole mountain to myself. A few hours in, I reached the ridge. The summit wasn't far now, maybe another 40 minutes. I checked my GPS to confirm I was on track. Everything seemed fine. I pushed on, eager to get to the top. That's when I noticed something strange. Ahead, the trail curved around a large rock face. As I rounded the bend, I saw something on the ground. A torn piece of fabric caught on a bush. It was bright red. I stopped and looked closer. The edges were frayed, like it had been there for a while. Nearby, I saw a half-buried water bottle, dirty and sun-bleached. It looked like someone had been here recently, but there was no sign of anyone now. I felt uneasy but kept walking. People lose things on trails all the time. Maybe it was nothing, but as I continued, I saw more. A single hiking boot lying on its side, a backpack strap torn and tangled in a branch. The deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. My breathing slowed, my senses sharpened. I scanned the area. Still no one. The wind was stronger now, pushing against me as if trying to tell me to turn back. I ignored it. Then I smelled it. Something foul, something rotten. My stomach tightened. I knew that smell. Decay. I hesitated, but my legs kept moving. The smell got worse. I forced myself to take slow, careful steps. The wind shifted, and suddenly, I saw it. A body. It was slumped against a boulder, partially hidden by shrubs. The skin was pale, the face unrecognizable. The clothes were torn, dirt and dried blood covering the fabric. I felt my heart hammering in my chest. My first instinct was to back away, but I stopped myself. I needed to think. I checked my phone. No signal. My brain raced. What should I do? Go back? Try to find help? But then something else caught my eye. Marks on the ground. Drag marks. As if something or someone had been moved. My stomach churned. I turned around, suddenly hyper-aware of my surroundings. The forest was silent now. Too silent. No birds, no rustling leaves. Just the wind and my own breathing. My gut told me I wasn't alone. I started walking back, faster this time. My footsteps crunched against the dirt, the only sound in the eerie quiet. I kept glancing over my shoulder, my skin prickling with unease. The further I got from the body, the worse the feeling got, like something was watching me. Then I heard it. A branch snapped. Close. Too close. I froze. My pulse pounded in my ears. I turned my head slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing. Just shadows. But I knew something was there. I forced myself to move, walking faster now. My hands clenched into fists. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to run. But I didn't. Running meant panic. Panic meant mistakes. I needed to get back to the truck. That was all that mattered. Another sound. A rustling, like footsteps crunching through leaves. I didn't wait. I picked up the pace, my breath coming in short bursts. The forest felt endless. I couldn't tell how far I had left to go. My GPS was still useless. I kept my eyes forward, forcing myself not to look back. Whatever was behind me, I didn't want to see it. Then up ahead, I saw it, the clearing. My truck. Relief flooded through me, but I didn't slow down. I reached the vehicle, yanked the door open, and jumped inside. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life. I threw it into reverse, tires spinning against the dirt. As I sped away, I stole one last glance in the mirror. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, too far to see clearly, but close enough to know one thing. It was watching me. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I just drove, faster than I ever had before, not slowing down until I reached the main road. Only then did I let out the breath I'd been holding. I called the authorities the second I had service. They asked questions. I gave them the details. They told me they'd send a search team. I never heard anything more after that. No reports, no news. It was like it never happened. But I know what I saw, and I know someone else was there that day. I haven't been back since, and I never will. I never wanted to hike alone, but sometimes life forces you into things you don't want to do. It wasn't about bravery, just necessity. I needed the quiet, the isolation, a break from everything. That's what I told myself when I parked my truck at the trailhead that morning. I had planned it all: extra water, a good knife, a fully charged phone, even a printed map in case my GPS failed. I wasn't an amateur. The trail was supposed to be an easy out and back, 12 miles total through rolling hills, some thick tree cover, and a few open stretches. I had read that there were some parts of the trail where the cell service cut out, but that didn't bother me. I'd be back before sundown. No problem. The first few miles were peaceful. The wind moved through the trees, birds sang, and the occasional rustle in the brush reminded me that I wasn't completely alone out there. It was the kind of quiet I'd been craving. The weight on my shoulders, the one I carried from everyday life, seemed to lighten. I kept a steady pace, stopping every so often to sip water and check my progress. About 5 miles in, the trail started to change. It wasn't drastic, just small things, fewer signs, less visible wear on the path, as if fewer people made it out this far. The trees were taller, denser, and the sounds of birds started to fade. The further I went, the more unnatural it felt. Not in a supernatural way, just wrong. It was that gut feeling, the one that tells you something isn't quite right even when you can't see anything out of place. I pushed on. The trail became harder to follow. Maybe it was the overgrowth, or maybe I was just overthinking it. But I knew I was still on track. The map said there would be an old fire road about 6 miles in, and once I hit that, I could turn back if I wanted. I never found it. Somewhere around that point, things got weird. The trail seemed to shift. I don't mean the terrain changed, I mean I would take a turn, and suddenly the path behind me didn't look the same. It wasn't just my imagination. I had marked a tree with my knife at one point. Just a small scratch, a habit I picked up over the years. But when I glanced back, it wasn't there. I told myself I had missed it, that I was just tired. But I wasn't tired. I was sharp, paying attention to every step I took. I had to be. Then I started to feel it, the sensation of being watched. It wasn't paranoia. This was something else. My skin prickled. The air felt heavier. Every few minutes, I would stop and listen. Nothing. Just the wind. Just the trees creaking. I picked up my pace. After another mile, I stopped. The trail had split. I hadn't seen anything about a fork on the map. I pulled it out, traced my finger along the route, double-checked my GPS. Nothing about a split. One side sloped gently downward, vanishing into thick brush. The other climbed a steep ridge, leading toward open ground. I took the high road, better visibility, less chance of getting turned around. The climb was brutal. My legs burned. My breath came in sharp bursts, but I pushed forward. When I reached the top, I expected relief. Instead, my stomach dropped. I wasn't where I should have been. The trail had changed again. The trees, the landscape, it was off. And then I saw it. A campsite, not a fresh one. Old, abandoned. A tent, half collapsed, torn at the seams. A rusted-out fire pit. Scattered gear. I stepped closer. Clothing, shredded. A backpack, its contents spilled into the dirt. Empty water bottles. A crushed granola bar wrapper. And then the knife. It was stuck in the ground beside the fire pit. Blade down, the handle worn smooth. Someone had left it there. I stood there for a long time, listening. The wind had stopped. The trees were still. I wasn't alone. There were no sounds, but I knew. I turned, slow and careful, scanning the trees. My breath was shallow, controlled. I didn't move fast. I didn't run. Running is what prey does. I took a step, then another. Then I saw it. Farther down the ridge, where the trees thickened, a shape. Not an animal, not a hiker, just a shape. Standing, watching. My body took over. I moved fast, controlled. I didn't look back. I made my way down the ridge, not caring if I made noise. I just needed to move. When I reached the fork in the trail, I didn't hesitate. I took the lower path. It wasn't about choosing the right way anymore. It was about getting out. The trail twisted through dense brush, the ground uneven. My foot caught on a root and I went down hard. Pain shot up my arm as I caught myself. I looked up. Silence. Then a step. Not mine. Closer. I scrambled to my feet and ran. I didn't care about noise. I didn't care about anything except distance. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they would give out. Then I saw it, the scratch on the tree, the one I had made. I was back on the right path. I kept moving, no stopping, no checking behind me. It took me another hour to reach my truck. I practically threw myself inside, locking the doors, starting the engine with shaking hands. I didn't look back. I don't know who was out there. I don't know if they were alone. I just know I wasn't supposed to find that campsite, and someone wanted to make sure I didn't leave. But I did, and I won't ever go back. I had been planning this hike for months. The Blackridge Trail was known for being tough, remote, and wild. Exactly what I wanted. I had done plenty of hikes before, but never one this isolated. I was prepared, though. I had my pack loaded with everything I needed: food, a water filter, a first aid kit, a satellite phone, and my GPS. I even brought a backup map just in case. The trail started easy, winding through thick pine forests. The air was fresh. The only sounds were birds and the crunch of my boots on dirt. I felt strong, moving steadily, enjoying the peace. Hours passed, and I pushed deeper into the mountains. The trees became denser, the terrain rougher. I climbed over fallen logs, crossed streams, and followed the faint markings that showed I was still on the right path. Around midday, I stopped to eat. I sat on a rock overlooking a valley, the view stretching for miles. I felt completely alone. Not in a bad way, just aware of how far I was from everything. After a short break, I kept going. The trail grew steeper. I had to use my hands in places, gripping roots and rocks to pull myself up. Sweat dripped down my back. I checked my GPS often, making sure I stayed on course. At some point, I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in a while. The path had become less defined, more like an animal trail than something meant for people. I pulled out my map and tried to make sense of where I was. My GPS still showed I was on the right track, but the landscape didn't match what I expected. I kept moving, trusting my gear. Then I saw it, a boot print in the dirt. Someone else had been here. It looked fresh, maybe a day old. That was reassuring. I wasn't completely alone. But as I continued, something felt off. The trees pressed in closer, and the silence grew heavy. No more birds, no rustling from small animals, just my breathing and the sound of my boots. Then I smelled it, a sharp, sour scent, like something had died. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was there. I tried to ignore it and moved faster. A few minutes later, I found the source, a deer, half-rotted, lying just off the trail. His body was torn open, ribs exposed. Flies buzzed around it, but something wasn't right. The cuts looked too clean, like they hadn't been made by an animal. The legs were twisted at odd angles, broken but not chewed. I felt uneasy. Predator would have eaten more. This seemed like something done for no reason. I moved past it quickly. An hour later, the path disappeared completely. I stopped and pulled out my map again. I was lost. My GPS still showed a route, but the land in front of me didn't match. I should have been on a clear ridge, but all I saw were thick trees. I tried to retrace my steps, but nothing looked familiar. Then I saw another boot print. This one was deeper, like someone had been standing still for a while. I kept walking, hoping to find the trail again. My legs were sore, my breathing heavier. Then I saw something ahead, a pile of rocks stacked in a strange way, almost like a marker. I moved closer. That's when I saw the next one. Another pile just like the first, and another, a line of them leading deeper into the woods. Someone had made these. I didn't know if I should follow them or not. My gut told me no, but I was already off course. Maybe they led back to the trail. I took a step toward them, then stopped. The smell was back, stronger this time. Not just rot, but something else. Sweat, maybe. Something human. I turned and started moving in the opposite direction, trying to ignore the feeling in my stomach. I kept walking, pushing through branches, tripping over roots. I needed to find the trail. Then I saw it, another boot print. Not old, fresh, the dirt still loose. I wasn't alone. Panic set in. I moved faster, heart pounding. My GPS beeped, low battery. I pulled out my map, trying to calm myself. I needed to think. Then I heard it, a branch snapping. Close. I froze, holding my breath. My pulse throbbed in my ears. Silence. Then another sound, closer this time. A slow, deliberate step. I turned, scanning the trees. Nothing. I pulled out my knife, gripping it tightly. I wasn't going to be some missing hiker story. I moved, keeping my steps quiet, careful. I didn't know where I was going, but I needed to get out. Then I saw something ahead. A shape, person. I ducked behind a tree, watching. The figure was standing still. Too still. Not searching, not moving, just watching. I didn't wait. I turned and ran. Branches whipped my arms. My legs burned, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran until my lungs felt like they would burst. Then I saw it. An old fire pit, half buried in leaves. A sign of a campsite, civilization. I kept running, desperate. Minutes later, I found the trail. The real trail. I recognized the markers, the packed dirt. Relief flooded me, but I didn't stop. I hiked out of those woods faster than I ever had in my life. When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors and sat there, shaking. I checked my GPS. The route it had shown me where I had been wasn't part of the official trail. Someone had led me off course. I drove away without looking back. When I got home, I reported what I had seen. The authorities said they would check it out. I never heard back. I never went hiking alone again. The trail was supposed to be easy, a simple out-and-back hike to a viewpoint, 6 miles round trip. Nothing dangerous, nothing technical, just a walk in the woods with a good view at the end. That's what the guidebook said. I had done harder hikes before, longer ones with real elevation gain, but I just wanted something simple this time. A way to clear my head. The first few miles were fine. The air was crisp, the sun filtering through the trees in that way that makes everything feel peaceful. The trail was mostly dirt, a few rocky sections, but nothing that slowed me down. I had my backpack with the basics: water, some snacks, a first aid kit, a knife, and my phone. No service out here, but I wasn't worried. The trail was well marked, and the weather was perfect. No rain in the forecast, no reason to expect trouble. About 2.5 miles in, I reached a split in the trail. The main path continued ahead, but a smaller, less defined trail veered off to the right. There was no sign, but it looked like it had been used before. Maybe a shortcut? Maybe just a side trail leading to another viewpoint? I hesitated for a moment, then decided to take it. I figured it would meet back up with the main trail eventually. The further I went, the less defined the trail became. At first, it was just narrower, a little more overgrown. Then it started twisting in ways that didn't make sense, cutting back sharply and leading uphill at an angle that felt off. I kept thinking I'd see the main trail again any second, but it never came. My breathing was heavier now, my legs burning a little from the incline. I paused, taking a sip of water, and looked around. That's when I realized how quiet it had gotten. The wind had stopped. No birds. No rustling in the underbrush, just silence. I told myself it was nothing. I had just gotten too deep into my own head, focusing too much on the hike. Still, the silence felt wrong, like something was waiting. I kept walking, convinced I had to be close to the main trail, but the path kept getting worse. Loose dirt, more rocks, steeper sections that forced me to grab onto tree roots for support. I checked my phone, no signal, of course. I tried to get my bearings, but the trees were too thick to see anything beyond them. No mountain peaks, no clearings, just more forest in every direction. I should have turned around. I knew that, but I had that stubborn voice in my head saying, just a little farther. The trail has to be close. I pushed forward. That's when I saw the first piece of cloth. It was red, snagged on a branch, torn and faded. Not old enough to be from decades ago, but not fresh either. My stomach tightened. People lose things in the woods all the time. Hats, jackets, sometimes even backpacks. But something about this piece of fabric made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the fact that it was there. It was the way it was caught, stretched tight as if someone had been pulled forward while wearing it. I kept going slower now, watching my step. Another 100 feet and I saw more signs. A shoe, half buried in leaves, the sole peeling away. A water bottle, empty, lying on its side in the dirt. None of it was new. The shoe had moss growing on it. The bottle was clouded with age. That's when I saw the rope. It was thick, stretched between two trees at about chest height. A snare, not for animals, too high for that. It was meant for a person. My mouth went dry, my hands started shaking. I turned around, ready to go back the way I came. That's when I heard it. A snap, a branch breaking somewhere behind me. Not close, but not far either. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. I listened. Nothing. I waited a few seconds, then took a step. Another snap. Closer this time. I took off running. I didn't care about being quiet. I just needed to get out. My heart pounded. My breath came in short gasps. My boots slipping on loose dirt. I ran until my legs burned, until my lungs felt like they were on fire. When I finally stopped, I bent over, hands on my knees, gasping for air. I had no idea where I was. The trail was gone. I had gone too far, too fast, crashing through brush, not thinking. I spun around, looking for any sign of where I had come from, but everything looked the same. Trees, rocks, dirt. No markers, no footprints, no signs of a trail. That's when I saw the footprint. Not mine. Bigger, deeper, fresh. I wasn't alone. I forced myself to move, walking fast but trying to stay quiet. My head pounded with every heartbeat. I kept checking behind me, waiting to see movement, a shadow, anything. The forest pressed in, the silence unbearable. Then I saw it. A cabin. Small, old, half hidden by trees. The door was slightly open. My first instinct was to avoid it, but I had no choice. I needed shelter, needed to think. I stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Rotting wood, damp air, something else, something metallic. The floor was covered in dirt and leaves, the furniture broken, and in the corner, stacked neatly, were backpacks. 5 of them, different colors, different sizes, some faded, some newer. My stomach dropped. On the wall, carved into the wood, were names, dozens of them, some scratched out, some with dates beside them. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Outside. Slow. Deliberate. I didn't think. I grabbed my knife, pressed myself against the wall, and listened. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Breathing. Heavy. Just standing there. Then, the door creaked open a little more. I didn't wait. I ran. Out the back. Through the trees. Running like my life depended on it, because it did. I didn't stop. Didn't look back. Just kept moving, pushing through branches, stumbling over roots. Then finally I saw it. The main trail. I nearly collapsed onto it, gasping, shaking. I turned, expecting to see someone behind me, but there was nothing. Just trees, just silence. I made it back to my car in record time. Locked the doors, hands shaking as I started the engine. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see if something was there. I reported it. The police went out, found the cabin, found the backpacks, found the names, but they never found anyone. And some of those names, they were people who had gone missing years ago. I don't hike alone anymore. The hike started like any other. I parked at the trailhead just after sunrise, laced up my boots, and tightened the straps on my backpack. The air was cool, the kind that makes you take a deep breath and feel awake. A long day ahead, but I was ready. This trail wasn't well known. That was part of the appeal. I liked the solitude, the quiet. No people talking, no cars in the distance. Just the sound of my own footsteps and the wind in the trees. I had done my research. It was about 15 miles total, an out-and-back trail with a decent incline. A challenge, but nothing too extreme. The first few miles were peaceful. The path wound through thick trees, sunlight filtering in patches through the leaves. I kept an easy pace, adjusting the straps on my pack when needed, keeping my breathing steady. Birds called overhead. Squirrels rustled in the undergrowth. Every so often, I stopped to sip water and check my map. Everything was going according to plan. Around mile 6, the trail got steeper. I focused on my footing, making sure I didn't slip on loose dirt. The trees started thinning out, giving way to rocky ground and shorter vegetation. The air felt thinner here, but that was normal. I liked the burn in my legs, the way my heart pounded in a steady rhythm. I reached the halfway point a little before noon, a small clearing with a view of the valley below. I dropped my pack, sat on a flat rock, and pulled out my lunch. Just a simple sandwich, some trail mix. I took my time eating, enjoying the silence. The wind had picked up, a steady breeze that sent a chill over my skin. I zipped my jacket up and leaned back, closing my eyes for a moment. Something wasn't right. It was subtle at first, just a feeling, like the way the air changes before a storm. I sat up, scanning the trees. Nothing, no movement, no sound even. The birds had stopped. That was what made me nervous. Birds don't just stop making noise unless something scares them. I shook it off. Probably just a coincidence. I wasn't in the mood to spook myself over nothing. I packed up my things and stood, rolling my shoulders. Time to head back. About a mile down the trail, I noticed the first odd thing. A footprint, deep in the dirt, off to the side of the path. At first, I didn't think much of it. Plenty of people hiked these trails, but something about it didn't sit right. It was fresh, very fresh, and there was only one. I frowned and kept moving. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone stepped there, then walked on rocks where their footprints didn't stick. Maybe they turned around. Maybe I was overthinking. The wind picked up again, stronger this time. It howled through the trees, making the branches sway. I tightened my straps and kept walking. The feeling of unease didn't go away. Another mile passed. Then I saw it. A backpack. It was lying just off the trail, partially hidden in the undergrowth. The fabric was torn, the zippers open. I stopped, staring at it. My first thought was that someone had left it behind, maybe animals had gotten to it. But that didn't explain why it was here, in the middle of nowhere, with no sign of its owner. I took a step closer. The contents were scattered. A water bottle half empty, a jacket, a small notebook, the pages torn. No wallet, no ID. I swallowed hard. This wasn't right. I looked around, scanning the trees. No movement, no sounds, just the wind. I thought about calling out, but something stopped me. A deep gut feeling. I didn't want to alert anyone, or anything, that I was here. I backed away slowly, keeping my steps quiet. My heart was pounding now. Another mile. That's when I heard it. A branch snapping. Close. Too close. I froze. Listened. Breathing. Not mine. Heavy, uneven. I turned, scanning the trees. Nothing. Then movement. Just a flicker. A shadow shifting between the trees. My stomach dropped. I wasn't alone. I didn't wait. I started walking, fast but not running. Running would make noise. Running would tell whoever or whatever it was that I was scared. The breathing followed me. Not right behind me, but close. Too close. My hands were shaking. I forced myself to stay calm. Think. I needed a plan. I had a knife in my pack. Not much, but better than nothing. I reached back slowly, careful not to make sudden movements, and gripped the handle. Another noise, this time to my left, then my right, more than one. I was being followed. I picked up my pace. My legs burned, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. Another noise, closer, a footstep, definitely a footstep. I gritted my teeth. Almost there, just a few more miles. Then I saw it, the trailhead, my car. Relief flooded through me, but I didn't slow down. Not until I was there, yanking the door open, throwing myself inside, slamming the lock down. I sat there, chest heaving, staring into the trees. Nothing, just trees, just silence. But I knew, someone had been there, watching, following. I turned the key. The engine roared to life. I didn't waste time. I backed out, gravel crunching under my tires, and sped down the road, not stopping until I was miles away. I never went back to that trail, never looked up reports, never checked the news. I didn't want to know. All I know is that I wasn't alone out there, and whoever or whatever was following me, they wanted me to know it. I checked the time on my watch. 3:45 p.m. Plenty of daylight left, but the heavy clouds rolling in from the west made it seem later. The wind had started picking up too, carrying the damp, earthy scent of rain. I had been hiking for about 4 hours, deep into the national forest, following an old trail I found on an outdated map. The trail was faint in places, barely a path at all, but I liked that about it. Fewer people, less noise. I had started early, packed light, a day pack with water, some snacks, a first aid kit, and a rain jacket. I wasn't planning to stay out long, just a quick out and back to see if the trail led anywhere interesting. I had read online that there used to be a fire lookout somewhere along this ridge, abandoned decades ago. I wanted to find it. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No distant highway noise, no other hikers, Just the sound of my boots on damp soil, the occasional snap of a branch underfoot, and the rhythmic rustle of leaves moving in the wind. Felt good being out here alone. Peaceful. I kept going, scanning for any sign of the old lookout. My GPS had lost signal a while back, but I wasn't too worried. I had a compass, and the trail, what little of it remained, seemed to follow the ridge. As long as I kept my bearings, I could find my way back. Around 5 p.m., I noticed something odd. The trail suddenly dipped down into a gully, steeper than before. It looked washed out, as if heavy rains had eroded part of the path. The trees were denser here, the undergrowth thick. I hesitated. If I went down, I'd have to climb back up, and it was already getting late, but curiosity pushed me forward. The descent was trickier than I expected. The loose soil slid under my boots, and I had to grab onto branches to keep my balance. The air felt different down here, still heavy. The sound of the wind above was gone. Just silence, except for my breathing and the occasional distant bird call. At the bottom of the gully, I spotted something unnatural among the trees. A rusted metal structure, partially collapsed. My pulse quickened. The lookout? I stepped closer, brushing past thick ferns. No, not a lookout. It looked more like an old hunting platform or an equipment tower, barely standing, its frame eaten away by time and weather. The wood was dark with rot, the metal rusted through in places. A ladder led up one side, but it didn't look safe to climb. I circled it, looking for any signs of what it had been used for. No plaques, no markings, just a forgotten structure, lost in the woods. And then I saw something else, a trail. Not the one I had been following, but a much older path, overgrown and barely visible. It led away from the tower, deeper into the trees. My gut told me to turn back. I checked the time again. 5:20 p.m. The sky had darkened. If I went any farther, I'd be pushing my luck with daylight. But there was something about that path. It felt different, like it had a purpose, like it had been used recently. The earth was packed down, disturbed. Someone had walked this way not long ago. I made a choice, a bad one in hindsight. I followed the path. The trees closed in tighter, their branches low enough to brush against my face. The undergrowth thinned, and the trail became clearer. I walked for another 15 minutes, keeping track of my steps. I turned back at the 20-minute mark, no matter what. Then I smelled it. Rot. Not the damp, earthy smell of decay that you sometimes get in the woods. This was sharper, heavier. The unmistakable stench of something dead. I slowed down, scanning the ground ahead. The trail dipped again, leading into another depression. The smell was stronger here. I covered my nose with my sleeve and moved forward carefully. That's when I saw it. A deer carcass sprawled across the trail. Fresh, but something was wrong with it. Its body was twisted unnaturally, its legs bent at sharp angles. Its ribcage was exposed, picked clean, but there were no scavengers. No birds, no bugs, just silence. I felt my heartbeat in my ears. Something wasn't right. I took a step back. Then I noticed the footprints. Not animal, human, barefoot. The prints were pressed deep into the soft earth around the deer, circling it. I traced them with my eyes, following their pattern. They weren't moving in a straight line. They meandered, stopping here and there. The strides were uneven, almost staggering. My hands went cold. I turned around and walked back the way I came, faster than before. I didn't run. I didn't want to make noise, but my legs moved quickly, almost on their own. I kept my head on a swivel, scanning the trees. My breath came short and fast. I reached the old metal structure again. The gully. I scrambled up the slope, hands grasping at roots and rocks, slipping once, catching myself. My backpack felt heavier. The wind had picked up again, a low howl filtering through the trees. I didn't stop. I kept going, pushing my legs to move faster, even when they burned. The trail looked different now, unfamiliar. Had I taken a wrong turn? No, I was sure this was the way, but it felt off. The woods stretched longer than they should have. My watch said 6:10 p.m. I should have been closer to the main trail by now. Then I heard it. a rustling behind me, not the wind, something moving. I didn't look back. I picked up the pace, my boots hitting the dirt hard, breath ragged. The rustling came again, closer. Footsteps, slow, measured. I broke into a run. Branches whipped against my arms and face, but I didn't stop. The trail blurred under my feet. My pack bounced against my shoulders. My only thought was getting out, getting back to the car. The trees thinned. The light changed. I could see the main trail ahead, a small break in the endless green. I pushed harder, lungs burning. I didn't stop running until I burst into the clearing near the trailhead. My car was there, right where I left it. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking. Got the door open, threw myself inside, and locked it. Silence. Just my own breathing, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I forced myself to look back toward the trail. Nothing. The trees stood still, dark and unmoving. The wind had stopped. I sat there for a long time, gripping the wheel, trying to slow my breath. Then I started the car and drove. I didn't look back again. I don't know who or what was out there, but I know I'll never go back to that trail again. I set out early, just as the sun began to creep over the horizon. The air was cool, the kind of crispness that comes before the day fully wakes. My pack was heavy on my back, filled with enough supplies for an overnight stay. I had planned this solo hike for weeks, carefully mapping my route through the dense wilderness, following an old, rarely used trail I had read about in a forum. It wasn't well marked, but I liked the challenge. I enjoyed the quiet, the feeling of being out there alone with nothing but the trees and the sound of my own footsteps. The first few miles were easy, the trail wide and mostly clear, though fallen branches and overgrown brush made it clear that not many people had come this way recently. The further I went, the more the trail narrowed, winding deeper into the forest, the canopy growing thicker overhead. The silence out here was different. Not the peaceful quiet I was used to, but a heavier kind of silence, like the trees themselves were watching. I shook off the thought and kept walking. About 3 hours in, I reached the creek I had marked on my map. The water was clear, rushing gently over smooth stones. I refilled my bottle, took a short break, and checked my GPS. Everything looked good. I was right on track. My goal was to reach an old fire tower at the top of a ridge before nightfall. It was supposed to have a great view, and I planned to camp nearby. The trail got harder after the creek. The incline was steeper, and the ground was uneven, covered in loose rocks and roots that tried to trip me up every few steps. I was sweating now, even in the cool air. I focused on my footing, pushing forward, one step at a time. Around midday, I noticed something strange. The forest felt off. At first, I couldn't place it, but then I realized there were no sounds. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just the wind moving through the trees. It unsettled me. Even in deep woods, you usually hear something. I stopped to listen, but the silence pressed against my ears. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the cooler weather had made the wildlife quiet. I kept walking. An hour later, I saw the first sign that something was wrong. A deer carcass just off the trail. It wasn't old, there was still fresh blood on the ground. But the way it was torn apart didn't look like a predator's kill. Something had ripped it open, its ribs cracked, its organs missing. I crouched down, my stomach twisting. There were no tracks around it, no signs of struggle. Just the body, torn open like something had taken what it wanted and left the rest. I stood up quickly and kept moving. The fire tower wasn't far now. I could see the ridge through the trees, the peak just ahead. I wanted to get there before dark. The unease sat heavy in my gut, but I pushed it down. The faster I got to my campsite, the better. As I climbed, the trees started thinning out, giving me glimpses of the valley below. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the ground. I was close, just a little farther. Then I smelled it, a foul, rotting stench, thick and cloying in the cold air. My stomach lurched. It wasn't just the deer. This was worse, stronger. I covered my nose and kept walking, my body tense. I didn't want to stop. I just needed to get to the fire tower. When I reached the clearing, I almost collapsed with relief. The tower stood tall against the darkening sky, old but sturdy. I dropped my pack, my legs aching. I could see the valley stretching out below, the tops of trees rolling like an endless ocean. It should have been beautiful, but the smell was still there, stronger now. I turned, scanning the tree line, and that's when I saw it. Something was hanging from the trees. First, I thought it was another deer, but as I stepped closer, my breath caught in my throat. It was a backpack, a tattered, filthy backpack, strung up by a rope, swaying slightly in the breeze. And below it, half buried in the dirt, were bones. Human bones. Panic shot through me like ice. My mind raced. Someone had been here before me, and they hadn't left. I backed away, my heart pounding. The silence pressed down again, heavier than before. My eyes darted around the clearing. The tower. It was my only option. I grabbed my pack and ran. The steps groaned under my weight as I climbed, taking them 2 at a time. When I reached the top, I slammed the hatch shut and locked it. My chest heaved as I pressed myself against the wall, forcing slow breaths. From up here, I had a clear view of the trail, the clearing, the trees, and then movement. At the edge of the tree line, something stepped out. A man. He was tall, thin, dressed in filthy clothes. His face was shadowed, but I could see he was staring up at me, watching. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, his head slightly tilted, like he was studying me. I didn't move either. I didn't breathe. My fingers tightened around the knife on my belt. Then he turned and walked back into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my back against the wall, my knife clutched tight. Every sound made my muscles tense. Every shift of the wind made my heart race. When the first light of dawn touched the treetops, I moved. I climbed down the tower, my body stiff and aching. The clearing was empty. The bones were still there. The backpack still hung from the tree, but the man was gone. I didn't stop to check. I didn't look back. I moved fast, retracing my steps, pushing my body past exhaustion. The feeling of being watched never left. I reached my car just as the sun was fully up. I threw my pack inside, locked the doors, and drove without stopping. My hands shook the entire way home. I never reported what I found. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to believe it was real. Maybe I was afraid of what they would find if they searched those woods. I haven't gone hiking alone since. The sun was already dipping below the tree line when I realized I had made a mistake. The trail had seemed easy enough at first, just a simple out and back through a dense section of forest, a nice way to clear my head after a stressful week. The reviews had said it was well marked and straightforward, but something had gone wrong. I checked my phone again. No signal. That wasn't surprising. I had expected it. What I hadn't expected was just how quickly everything around me had started to feel unfamiliar. The trees were thicker than they should have been, pressing in from both sides. The path had narrowed, almost as if it was fading back into the earth. My footsteps felt too loud against the silence. I took a deep breath and told myself to stay calm. It was fine. People got turned around all the time while hiking, especially when the sun started setting. I just needed to backtrack. The problem was, when I turned around, the trail behind me looked even less familiar. I knew I had followed the markers. I had paid attention. And yet, standing there, I couldn't see a single one. My stomach tightened. I scanned the trees, searching for anything. Painted blazes, a broken branch, a sign that I was still somewhere known. But the forest just stood there, unmoving, uncaring. I tried to retrace my steps, moving slower this time, but everything looked the same. I had no way of knowing if I was actually going back the way I came or wandering deeper into the woods. My breathing grew uneven, and I had to remind myself not to panic. Panic led to bad decisions. I had water, a small flashlight, and a granola bar in my pack. Worst case, I could spend the night and find my way back in the morning. That thought settled me for a moment. I wasn't in immediate danger, I had resources, but then something shifted. It was subtle at first, just a feeling, like the air itself had thickened. Then I noticed the quiet. The forest wasn't just still. It was dead. No wind, no rustling leaves, no birds or distant insects. It was unnatural. I swallowed hard and forced myself to keep moving. My flashlight was small, but it was bright enough to cut through the early darkness. As I stepped forward, the beam bounced off something pale in the dirt. A footprint. Relief surged through me. People had been here. Maybe I was closer to the main trail than I thought. But when I crouched down, my stomach twisted. The print wasn't fresh. The edges had softened, the dirt slightly filled in. I turned my light forward, scanning ahead. More prints, but something about them wasn't right. They weren't spaced evenly. Some were deep, as if whoever left them had been running. Others barely pressed into the soil. I followed them with my light until they disappeared into the undergrowth. My pulse hammered. I wasn't alone. I listened hard, trying to hear past the suffocating silence. Nothing.
No briefing, no footsteps, no rustling.
Just that horrible, thick quiet. My mind started filling in gaps, feeding me images of someone crouched just out of sight, waiting. I had to move. I turned sharply, deciding to go in the opposite direction of the prints. I walked fast but careful, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. My ears strained for any sound, anything that would tell me I wasn't just imagining things. Then I heard it. A single snap, a branch breaking. I froze. The sound had come from behind me, close but not too close. I turned slowly, lifting the flashlight. The trees stared back, empty. Another snap, closer this time. My skin crawled. Something was out there. Someone. I took a shaky breath and started moving again. This time I didn't stop. I walked faster, my legs burning. My heartbeat was so loud in my ears that I almost missed the next sound. Footsteps. Not mine. I broke into a run. I didn't care if I tripped, if I lost the trail completely. I just needed to be anywhere but here. My flashlight swung wildly as I ran, the beam bouncing off tree trunks and flashes of underbrush. I could hear them behind me now, whoever it was. Their steps were heavy, fast. I pushed myself harder. My lungs burned, and my pack bounced against my back. Then, up ahead, I saw it, an opening, a break in the trees, a road. I practically threw myself forward, my legs screaming as I burst onto the asphalt. The sight of it nearly knocked the wind out of me. I turned, gasping, my flashlight cutting across the trees. Nothing. The forest stood still. No movement, no sound, just darkness pressing between the trunks. I didn't wait. I followed the road, forcing myself into a steady jog until I saw headlights in the distance. I waved my arms wildly, not caring how I looked. The car slowed, then stopped. The driver rolled down the window, concern in his eyes. "You okay?" I nodded too fast. "Got lost hiking." He looked past me at the forest, frowning. "This isn't near any of the trails." My stomach dropped. I didn't ask where I had come from. I didn't want to know. I just got in the car and didn't look back. I was supposed to be out there for 3 days. Just me, my pack, and the trail. I needed the break from work, from the noise, from everything. Hiking had always been my way to clear my head, and I'd done solo trips before. This was nothing new. The plan was simple. A loop through the national forest, about 30 miles in total. Nothing too challenging, just a good stretch of solitude in the woods. I parked my truck at the trailhead in the late afternoon, laced up my boots, and started walking. The first few miles were smooth. The trail was well marked, the air was cool, and the trees were alive with the sound of birds and rustling leaves. I found a good spot to set up camp as the sun dipped below the horizon. There was a clearing just off the trail with enough space to lay out my tent, and a small stream nearby for water. As I unpacked my gear, I noticed something odd. The quiet. The birds had stopped. The wind had settled. It was like the woods were holding their breath. I brushed it off, telling myself I was overthinking things. It wasn't uncommon for the forest to go quiet around dusk. I finished setting up my tent, cooked a simple meal, and crawled into my sleeping bag. I was tired from the hike, but sleep didn't come easy. I kept waking up to small sounds outside the tent. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. Probably just animals, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. The next morning, I broke camp early. The trail led me deeper into the woods, winding through thick pines and over rocky terrain. About 10 miles in, I came across something strange. A boot, just one, lying in the middle of the trail. It looked old, weathered, like it had been there for a while. I stopped and looked around. No sign of anyone, no tracks leading away, just the boot. I picked up my pace after that, trying to shake the unease crawling up my spine. By midday, I reached a ridge that overlooked a valley below. The view was stunning, but I didn't stop long. Something about the silence in the air unsettled me. I kept moving. That afternoon, I started noticing more strange things. A tattered piece of cloth caught in a tree branch. A backpack, half buried in leaves, its zippers broken. No sign of an animal attack. No sign of the owner. I told myself it had to be old. Maybe someone lost it years ago. But why did everything feel so off? The feeling got worse when I realized I hadn't seen any wildlife all day. No deer, no squirrels, no birds. Just silence. It wasn't normal. My gut told me to turn back, but I was already too far in. I pushed forward, trying to shake the growing unease. By evening, I found another spot to camp, though it didn't feel right. There was a clearing near a small lake, but the water was murky, and the ground felt damp and uneven. Still, I needed to rest. As I set up my tent, I noticed a tree nearby with deep scratches down its bark. Not claw marks, something else, something bigger. That night was worse than the first. I barely slept. I kept hearing something moving outside my tent. Slow, deliberate steps. Not an animal. Too heavy. Too calculated. I held my breath, listening. The steps circled my tent once. Then again. And then they stopped. I gripped my knife, waiting. Minutes passed. Then hours. Eventually, exhaustion won. When I woke up, the sun was up and everything was still. I packed my gear in a hurry and got moving. The trail felt different that day. Harder, like the forest itself wanted me gone. I pushed through, forcing myself forward. Then, about 5 miles from the end of my route, I found it. A campsite, torn apart. Tent, shredded. Gear scattered. It looked recent. Too recent. My stomach dropped. Someone had been here, and something had happened. I scanned the area, heart pounding. No bodies. No tracks leading away. Just destruction. I turned and walked faster. Then I ran. The last miles blurred together in a haze of fear and adrenaline. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just ran until I saw my truck waiting at the trailhead. When I reached it, I threw my pack in the back and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I never found out what happened at that campsite. I never told anyone. I just know that something was out there, watching, waiting, and I'll never go back. I woke up before sunrise, the air inside my tent damp and cold. The forecast had promised warm temperatures, but out here in the mountains, weather had its own rules. I unzipped my sleeping bag, my body stiff from the long hike the day before, and stretched my legs out. My boots, caked with dried mud, sat near the entrance. The fabric of my tent crinkled as I shifted, and for a few minutes, I just sat there, listening. Silence. Not a single bird chirping, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just the heavy stillness of the wilderness before dawn. That wasn't unusual at this time of the morning, but it still made me pause. I rubbed my arms, trying to shake off the eerie feeling settling in my gut. I was deep in the mountains, hiking solo for the weekend. No cell service, no nearby campsites, just me and the trail. It was exactly what I wanted until now. I boiled some water over my small camping stove and made instant coffee. The strong, bitter taste helped wake me up as I watched the sky brighten to a dull gray. The sun was taking its time. After packing up my tent and stuffing my gear into my backpack, I checked the map. I had planned to follow a ridge that looped back down toward the main trailhead, about 16 miles total. A long day, but doable. I liked pushing myself. I liked being alone. The trail started steep, cutting through thick forest. The trees pressed in, their trunks tall and straight, the ground damp with decaying leaves. The only sound was my own breathing and the crunch of my boots. An hour passed, then another. I moved steadily, my body adjusting to the rhythm of hiking. Then I noticed something odd. A few yards ahead, the dirt trail was torn up. Not like erosion from water or the occasional fallen tree root. This looked different. The earth was dug into, deep scratches gouged into the path. I stopped, adjusting my pack, and crouched down. They were fresh. The exposed soil was still moist, untouched by sun or wind. I looked around, scanning the trees, the underbrush. Nothing. The forest remained silent. No birds, no wind rattling branches. Just that awful, pressing quiet. Maybe a bear, I thought. I had seen signs of them before. Claw marks on tree trunks, overturned logs where they'd searched for insects. But something about these scratches didn't look right. They were too deep, too long, too deliberate. I stood up and kept walking, faster now. My hands felt clammy despite the cool air. I knew fear could play tricks on the mind, make shadows move, make you hear things that weren't there. But I also trusted my gut, and right now it was screaming at me to keep going. The deeper I hiked, the worse the feeling got. The trees seemed taller, the trail narrower. The daylight never fully reached the ground, leaving everything in a dull half-light. I kept catching glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, but every time I turned my head, there was nothing. I told myself it was just the wind, except there was no wind. Around midday, I reached a small clearing, perfect spot to rest and eat. I sat on a fallen log, my legs sore, my stomach growling. I chewed on some jerky, drank water, and let my body relax for the first time all day. That's when I saw it. Something was hanging from a low branch a few feet away. A bundle of sticks, tied together with what looked like twine. No, not twine, hair. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. The thing swung slightly, as if it had just been hung there. My breathing was too loud now, my pulse hammering in my ears. I stood up slowly, my legs shaky. My brain fought against logic. Maybe some other hiker made it a joke, a weird art project. Maybe I wasn't alone out here after all. That thought wasn't comforting. I didn't run. Running would make things worse. I slung my backpack over my shoulders and forced myself back onto the trail. My pace quickened, my boots crunching over twigs and gravel. Every step felt wrong, like I was going deeper into something I wasn't meant to find. Then the smell hit me, rotten, metallic, thick in the back of my throat. The smell of blood and decay. I gagged, my body tensing. I kept walking, but my eyes scanned the forest. And then I saw it, a deer, or what was left of one. Its body was torn open, its ribcage exposed, its legs splayed out at unnatural angles. The skin was peeled back, clean, like it had been done with a knife. But what really made my stomach clench was the head. It was missing. The forest stayed silent. I moved fast, almost jogging now. I needed to get back to the main trail. I needed to get out of here. I wasn't alone, and whatever else was here, it wasn't human. The trail twisted, and I followed it, heart hammering, lungs burning. My mind raced through possibilities. Some kind of predator? A mountain lion? But no animal I knew killed like that. And no animal tied things into trees. Then I heard footsteps. Behind me, heavy, deliberate. I turned. Nothing. I ran. I don't remember how long I sprinted. My body screamed, my vision blurred. The trail started sloping downward, familiar. I was getting close to the main path. Then I saw movement. Ahead, a figure, standing in the trees, watching. I couldn't see a face, just a shape. Tall, still. I stopped. My legs shook. The figure didn't move. My lungs burned from running, but I didn't dare take a step forward. Then it turned and walked away, not into the woods but down the path, the same way I needed to go. I had no choice. I followed, but cautiously, my heart thudding in my chest. The figure was always just ahead, never running, never turning around, just walking, then suddenly gone. The trail opened up. The parking lot was visible in the distance. My car. Safety. I didn't stop. I practically threw myself inside, locking the doors, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I sped out of there, gravel spraying behind me. I didn't look back. I don't know what I saw that day. I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. I will never hike alone again. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the trees, my mind trying to make sense of it all. I still can't. But I'm writing this down because I need to. Maybe it'll help someone else. Maybe it'll just help me. Either way, here it is. It was supposed to be a simple solo hike, an overnight trip in the woods. I had done plenty of them before. I wasn't new to it. I liked the quiet. I liked the isolation. I had everything I needed. My pack, my tent, enough food, and water. The trail I picked wasn't well traveled, but it was marked. That was good enough for me. I parked at the small gravel lot near the trailhead around noon. My plan was to hike about 10 miles in, set up camp, and hike back the next day. The weather was good, chilly but dry. The air smelled fresh, that deep earthy scent of fallen leaves and damp soil. The trees were mostly bare, their skeletal branches reaching up into the gray sky. The first few miles were easy. The trail wound through thick forest, the only sounds my own footsteps and the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. I saw no one. That was normal. Most people stuck to the more popular trails. I preferred the quiet ones. About 5 miles in, things started to feel off. I can't explain it. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me. The sounds of the forest seemed muffled. The wind barely moved the branches. I shrugged it off as paranoia. I had been alone in the woods plenty of times before, and I knew how the mind could play tricks on you. I kept walking. At around mile 8, I saw something strange. A tree, but not just any tree. Its bark was stripped in long, deep gashes, as if something with massive claws had torn into it. I stopped, staring at it. Bears could do that, but the cuts were too long, too straight. I ran my fingers over the marks. Fresh. The wood underneath was still damp, the scent strong. Whatever did this, did it recently. I kept moving a little faster now. The unease in my gut was growing. Every so often, I glanced behind me, but I saw nothing. The sun was starting to dip lower. I needed to find a good spot to set up camp. I wanted a clear view, nothing too enclosed. Eventually, I found a small clearing near a stream. Good enough. I set up my tent quickly, my hands moving faster than usual. I didn't like the way I felt. The silence was wrong. The woods never went silent. There was always something. Birds, insects, the distant crack of branches. But now, nothing. I forced myself to eat, even though I wasn't hungry. The feeling in my stomach was too tight. I kept my knife close, though I knew it wouldn't do much if something really wanted to get me. Darkness settled in fast. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, leaving the forest in a heavy blackness. My fire crackled weakly. That's when I heard it. A branch snapping. Not close, but not far either. I froze, listening. Then another. Closer. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, aiming it toward the trees. Nothing. Just the same skeletal branches. I exhaled. Maybe a deer. Maybe my nerves. Then something moved. I don't know what it was. A shadow. A figure. But it was there, just beyond the light between the trees. Too tall for an animal. Too still. My breath caught in my throat. I blinked, and it was gone. I stood up, my heart hammering. I scanned the darkness. Nothing. My brain screamed at me to pack up and leave. But hiking out in the dark, alone, was dangerous. I told myself I was imagining things. I had to be. I crawled into my tent, keeping my knife in my hand. Sleep was impossible. Every noise made my muscles tense. Every shift of the wind made my heart race. Hours passed. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke up to something scratching against the outside of my tent. Not an animal, not something small, something dragging against the fabric, slow and deliberate. I stopped breathing. My hand gripped my knife so tight it hurt. The scratching moved along the side of the tent, circling. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. I swallowed, barely managing to shift. I reached for my flashlight and, with one motion, turned it on and unzipped the tent. Nothing. The clearing was empty. My fire had burned down to glowing embers. The trees stood still. The scratching had stopped. I sat there, the light shaking in my hand. My breath came in short gasps. I wanted to pack up and go, but I couldn't force myself to move. My body felt wrong, like if I stepped out of the tent, something would be waiting. I stayed awake until dawn. As soon as there was enough light, I packed up and started hiking back. I moved fast, barely stopping to drink water. Every so often, I looked over my shoulder. I still felt it, the weight of something watching me. At mile 5, I saw another tree. Same gashes, but this time they were fresh. The wood still dripping. I didn't stop. By the time I reached my car, my legs were shaking. I threw my gear inside, locked the doors, and sat there, gripping the wheel. I looked back at the trail, expecting to see something. There was nothing. I don't know what happened out there. I don't want to know, but I won't be going back. And if you ever find yourself alone in the woods and everything goes silent, leave. Just leave. I parked my truck at the edge of the trailhead just before noon. The gravel crunched under my boots as I stepped out, stretching my legs after the long drive. The sky was a dull gray, the kind that made the air feel heavier than it should be. The forecast had called for mild weather, but something about the air felt wrong. Too still, too thick. I shook it off and grabbed my pack from the back seat, double-checking my supplies before locking up and heading toward the trail. I had planned this hike for months, a solo trek through a lesser-known stretch of wilderness, far from the tourist trails. It was supposed to be a challenge, a way to test myself. I had enough food for 3 days, a sturdy tent, a map, and my GPS. Everything was in order. I wasn't a beginner at this. I knew what I was doing. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail was narrow but well-defined, winding through dense trees. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no rustling leaves, just my own footsteps and the occasional creak of my backpack straps. It was the kind of quiet that gnawed at the back of your mind, making you second-guess every sound. I tried to ignore it and focused on making good time. A few hours in, I noticed the first odd thing. A tree, massive and gnarled, had deep claw-like marks along its trunk. I stopped, running my fingers over the grooves. They were fresh. I had seen claw marks before, bears, mountain lions, but these were too long, too deep. I took a photo with my phone, more out of habit than anything else, and moved on. The further I went, the more uneasy I felt. The stillness in the air hadn't changed. It felt unnatural, like the forest was holding its breath. I tried to chalk it up to paranoia. Being alone in the wilderness can do that to you. But then, I started noticing more strange things. Broken branches, some snapped clean through. Rocks overturned, as if something heavy had barreled through. By late afternoon, I had covered more ground than I expected. I should have felt good about that, but my nerves were shot. I decided to set up camp near a small clearing, not far from a creek. It was an ideal spot, flat ground, easy access to water. I pitched my tent quickly, forcing myself to focus on the routine. Unpack, gather wood, start a fire. By the time the flames took hold, the sun was dipping below the treetops, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch too far. As I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal, the feeling of unease only grew. The woods weren't just quiet anymore. They felt dead. I listened for something, anything, but there was nothing. No insects buzzing, no distant howls, not even the sound of the wind through the trees. Just silence, then a sound, faint, barely there, a rhythmic tapping like something knocking against wood. I turned my head, scanning the darkness beyond the fire's glow. Nothing. It was probably just a branch shifting in the wind, I told myself. Except there was no wind. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the trees. The beam cut through the dark, landing on the tree line. I held my breath, waiting for something to move. Nothing did, but the feeling that something was out there watching me refused to leave. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I still reached for my knife before crawling into my tent, just in case. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something, subtle movements, like footsteps in the underbrush. I kept the knife close, gripping it so hard my fingers ached. I reminded myself that animals move at night. That's all it was. I repeated it over and over until exhaustion won. I woke up to the sound of something breathing outside my tent. Shallow, slow breaths. Close. My heart slammed against my ribs as I stayed still, barely daring to breathe. The fabric of the tent barely separated me from whatever was out there. I gripped the knife tighter, trying to think. Should I make a noise? Stay silent? I had no idea what was out there. My brain screamed at me to do something, but my body refused to move. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the breathing stopped. I waited, straining to hear any movement. Nothing. Slowly, painfully, I reached for my flashlight and flicked it on. The inside of the tent was just as I left it. I exhaled shakily, forcing myself to move. I unzipped the flap an inch, just enough to peek outside. Nothing. The fire had burned low, but I could still make out the clearing. My gear was untouched. No signs of disturbance. But the ground outside my tent? Fresh tracks. Large, deep impressions in the dirt. Not boots. Not paws. Something else. Something I couldn't place. I stayed awake until dawn, my nerves shot. As soon as the sun rose, I packed up. I wasn't sticking around to find out what left those tracks. I had planned for a 3-day trek, but I was done. I checked my map and took the shortest route back toward my truck. The hike back felt different. The forest didn't feel dead anymore. The sounds had returned. Birds, the wind, the distant rustle of small animals. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. I picked up the pace, pushing myself harder than I ever had. By the time I reached my truck, my legs were shaking. I tossed my gear inside, slammed the door shut, and locked it. My hands were still trembling as I started the engine. I looked back once, just for a second. The trailhead was empty, nothing there, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something had watched me every step of the way. I don't know what was out there. I don't think I ever will. But I do know one thing: I won't be going back. I had planned the hike for months. The idea was to challenge myself. No marked trails, no designated campsites, just me, the wilderness, and the route I had mapped out through a lesser-known section of the national forest. I packed light but smart. Enough food for 3 days, a water filter, my GPS, a paper map as a backup, and all the essentials to survive if something went wrong. It was supposed to be an adventure, an escape from the noise of the world. The first day was perfect. The forest was dense but beautiful. I followed an old logging road for a few miles before cutting through thick underbrush to reach a ridgeline. The view was incredible, stretching for miles in every direction. I felt powerful, capable. I set up camp on a flat patch near a small stream and ate a quick meal before falling asleep to the sound of running water. On the second day, the terrain became more difficult. The forest was thicker and the ground uneven. I checked my GPS regularly, but I knew it was draining the battery fast. I relied more on my paper map, orienting myself with the ridges and valleys around me. By midday, I reached an old trail that was barely visible beneath decades of fallen leaves and pine needles. It wasn't on any official maps, but I followed it anyway, figuring it would make the hike easier. It led me deeper into the forest. The further I went, the less it felt like a trail, more like a place where something had once moved through the woods often enough to leave a faint path. I should have turned back, but I was stubborn. I pushed forward, thinking I could rejoin my planned route further ahead. By late afternoon, I realized I had made a mistake. The path had faded entirely, and I was surrounded by thick, towering trees. I checked my GPS, it was dead. My compass was still working, and I could read the map well enough, but I knew I was far off course. I decided to backtrack, but that was when I noticed something that sent a chill through me. There were no signs of my footprints. I had been walking for hours, yet the forest floor looked untouched. I stopped, scanning the ground, searching for any broken twigs or disturbed leaves that should have marked my path. There was nothing. It was like the forest had erased my presence. I told myself I must have veered slightly off my original route. I tried to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same. Every tree, every rock, every slope. It all blended together in an endless repetition of wilderness. I kept walking, thinking I would eventually recognize something. I didn't. The sun was sinking lower, and with it came the cold. My water supply was fine, but I was burning through calories fast. I needed to find a place to camp before nightfall. I stumbled upon a clearing just as the last light of day was fading. There was an old structure in the middle of it, what looked like the remains of a cabin. It was nothing more than a collapsed roof and rotting beams, but it meant that at some point people had been here. That gave me hope. I set up camp a short distance away, close enough to see the remains, but not close enough to feel like I was intruding. The night was eerily silent. No wind, no rustling of leaves, just the heavy stillness of the forest. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside my tent. It wasn't an animal. I knew the sounds of deer, raccoons, and bears. This was different, slow, purposeful. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps circled my tent once, then stopped. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight, and waited. Minutes passed, an hour. Eventually, I convinced myself that I had imagined it, that it was just my own paranoia playing tricks on me. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I packed up and left in a hurry. I didn't eat, didn't rest. I just wanted to put as much distance as possible between myself and that place. But no matter how far I walked, the forest didn't change. It was like I was trapped in a loop, moving through the same terrain over and over again. By midday, I found something that made my stomach drop. A footprint. But it wasn't mine. It was fresh, pressed deep into the soft earth. Someone was out here with me. I called out, hoping, maybe foolishly, that it was another hiker. No answer. I listened carefully, scanning the trees for movement. Nothing. The forest swallowed my voice like a grave. I decided to move faster. I picked a direction and stuck to it, focusing on the sun to keep me moving west. But as the hours passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The sun was low when I saw it. A figure in the distance, standing between the trees. It wasn't moving, just standing there, half hidden in the shadows. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to believe it was another lost hiker, but deep down, I knew better. They were too still, too quiet, and then they stepped back, disappearing into the trees. I ran. I didn't care about my direction anymore. I just ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes. I ran until my legs gave out and I collapsed, gasping for air. When I finally looked up, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The clearing, the ruined cabin. I was back. I had been running in circles. Panic took over. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing through every survival lesson I had ever learned. I needed to stay calm, think clearly. But how could I, when every instinct was screaming at me that I wasn't alone? The woods were watching. I forced myself to make a plan. I would stay put for the night, conserve energy, and at first light, follow the sun until I reached a river or a road. I set up my tent, built a fire, and kept my knife close. The night dragged on. I didn't sleep. I listened. And then, sometime past midnight, I heard it again. The footsteps. Closer this time. A single breath, just outside my tent. I didn't move, didn't even blink. Then silence. I stayed awake until dawn. The moment the sun broke through the trees, I packed up and walked. I didn't stop. I ignored my exhaustion, my hunger, my aching muscles. I walked until I found a river, then followed it downstream until I reached a road. A truck passed by hours later. The driver stopped when he saw me, probably because I looked half dead. He asked if I needed help. I told him I was lost. He asked where I had been. I told him I wasn't sure. He frowned, looking out at the woods behind me. "That whole stretch is empty," he said.
No trails, no cabins.
"Nothing but trees for miles." I didn't argue. I just got in the truck. I haven't gone hiking since. I had always been the type to seek out quiet places, far from crowds, where the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. There was something peaceful about being alone in nature. But sometimes, solitude isn't as comforting as you'd expect. It was late September, just cool enough that the mosquitoes had died down but warm enough that I could still hike comfortably in a long-sleeved shirt. I'd planned a solo hike in a remote part of a national forest, somewhere off-trail where I wouldn't run into anyone. I didn't like heavily traveled paths. Something about the worn-down dirt and constant sight of human footprints took away from the feeling of being in the wild. I wanted to be alone with nature, so I picked a spot far from the usual trails. I parked my truck in a pull-off near an unmarked path. I had mapped out a rough route beforehand, using topographical maps and satellite images to find a way through the dense forest and rolling hills. My plan was to hike a few miles in, set up camp near a small creek, and return the next morning. It wasn't a long trip, just a simple overnight to clear my head. The first couple of hours were uneventful. The forest was thick, mostly oak and hickory, with patches of pine scattered throughout. I made good time, navigating with my GPS and compass, and by late afternoon, I reached the creek. It was just as I'd expected, narrow, maybe 2 feet across, with clear water trickling over smooth rocks. Perfect place to set up camp. I pitched my tent on a flat patch of ground about 20 yards from the water. After gathering some dry wood, I started a small fire and sat back to enjoy the quiet. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows through the trees. I ate a simple meal of jerky and a protein bar, washing it down with water from my canteen. As darkness settled in, the usual sounds of the forest took over, the chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl. Everything was as it should be, but I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. It wasn't fear exactly, just a nagging sensation that something was off. I told myself it was just the natural anxiety of being alone in the wilderness, something I'd experienced before but had always pushed through. I crawled into my tent and zipped myself into my sleeping bag. The fire outside had burned down to glowing embers, casting a faint orange light on the fabric of my tent. I listened to the creek, its steady trickle calming me. Eventually, my eyes grew heavy, and I drifted off. I woke suddenly, unsure of what had disturbed me. The fire had gone out completely, and the forest was silent. Not just quiet silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just absolute stillness. I lay there, my heart pounding. Then I heard it, a sound, faint but distinct, coming from the direction of the creek. A soft splash, like something stepping into the water. I held my breath, straining to hear more. Another splash, then another. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving through the water. My first thought was that it was an animal, a deer maybe, but deer moved quickly and cautiously. These steps were steady, unhurried. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the creek. Nothing. The water rippled slightly, but there was no sign of movement. I stayed still for a long time, listening. The forest remained eerily silent. Eventually, I convinced myself that I had imagined it, that maybe a branch had fallen into the water, creating the sound. I turned off my flashlight and forced myself to close my eyes. I don't know how long I slept, but I woke again to the sound of movement. Not in the water this time, closer. In the leaves, just outside my tent. My breath caught in my throat. I could hear the distinct crunch of footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling my tent. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? Unlikely. A coyote? Maybe, but they usually moved in packs. This sounded like something bigger, something on two legs. I stayed as still as possible, gripping my flashlight like a weapon. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the tent. I could hear breathing, deep, measured breaths, like someone standing just inches from the thin layer of fabric separating us. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the breathing stopped. The footsteps retreated, slow at first, then quicker, fading into the distance. I waited, my muscles tense, for what felt like an eternity. When I was sure I was alone, I slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The forest was dark and empty. I hesitated, then grabbed my knife and flashlight and stepped outside. Nothing looked disturbed. No broken branches, no signs of an animal. Just my camp exactly as I had left it. But something still felt wrong. The forest was still unnervingly quiet. I made a decision. I wasn't staying until morning. I packed up my gear as quickly as possible, shoving everything into my backpack without caring about order. My hands were shaking as I doused the remnants of my fire and strapped on my pack. The hike back to my truck was the longest of my life. I moved quickly, checking my GPS repeatedly to make sure I was on the right path. Every few minutes, I stopped to listen, expecting to hear those footsteps again. But the forest remained silent. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear into the back, climbed in, and locked the doors. I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, trying to make sense of what had happened. I don't know what was out there that night. I don't know if it was another person, some animal moving strangely, or something else entirely. But I do know one thing: I've never gone hiking alone since. I don't know why I thought hiking alone was a good idea. Maybe I just needed to clear my head. Maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I could handle solitude, that I wasn't afraid of being out in the wild with nothing but my own instincts and a few supplies. Whatever the reason, I regret it now. The trail wasn't anything extreme, just a remote stretch in the Pacific Northwest, deep in the woods where the trees stretched high, their branches forming a thick canopy overhead. I had studied the route, packed enough food and water, and carried a reliable map. I had done everything right, or so I thought. The first few miles were peaceful. The ground was damp from the previous night's rain, and the scent of pine filled the air. Birds chirped somewhere in the distance, and the occasional rustling in the underbrush reminded me I wasn't completely alone, but I wasn't worried. I had checked for bear warnings, and the area was considered safe. Around midday, I reached a clearing where I decided to take a break. The sun had found its way through the trees, warming the damp earth. I pulled out a protein bar, drank some water, and checked my map. According to it, I had another 6 miles before I'd reach a small lake where I planned to set up camp for the night. That's when I noticed it, the silence. It had been a peaceful hike, but even in silence, there were always sounds. Birds, insects, the wind shifting through the branches. But now there was nothing, just the sound of my own breathing. I told myself it was normal. Maybe a predator was nearby, a bobcat or a coyote, causing everything else to go quiet. I shook it off and continued hiking. The deeper I went, the more unsettled I felt. It wasn't fear at first, just a growing sense of discomfort, like I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see another hiker or maybe a deer moving through the trees. But there was nothing, just the endless forest stretching behind me. At some point, I realized I hadn't seen any trail markers in a while. I stopped, pulled out my map again, and tried to figure out where I was. I should have come across a fork in the trail by now, but there was nothing but more trees and damp earth. My gut twisted. Had I missed a turn? I pulled out my phone, but of course there was no signal. I wasn't surprised, but it still made my stomach drop. I took a deep breath. I wasn't lost, not yet. I just needed to backtrack until I found the last marker. I turned around and started retracing my steps, but the deeper I walked, the more I realized something was wrong. Nothing looked familiar. I should have recognized a fallen tree or a large moss-covered boulder, but everything felt different, like the forest had shifted around me when I wasn't looking. My heart started to pound. I knew I had to stay calm. Panic would only make things worse. I reached into my pack for my compass. The needle spun lazily before settling, but when I turned in the direction it pointed, something felt off, like I was walking in the wrong direction. I tried to shake the feeling and kept moving. The sun was starting to sink lower, the light filtering through the trees in golden streaks. I needed to find the trail before dark, but after another 20 minutes of walking, I knew I was completely lost. I stopped, forcing myself to think. I had a tent, a flashlight, extra food. I could stay put for the night and try again in the morning. The safest thing to do was to conserve energy and wait until daylight when I could see more clearly. So I set up camp in a small clearing, my back to a large rock formation to block some of the wind. As the sun dipped lower, the temperature dropped, and the dampness of the forest settled into my bones. I built a small fire, trying to push away the unease curling in my stomach. Then, just as the last light of day disappeared, I heard it, a crunch. Not the kind of crunch a small animal makes. Not the scampering of a squirrel or the rustling of a raccoon. This was deliberate, slow, heavy. I froze, listening. My fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the trees. I turned my head slowly, scanning the darkness beyond the fire's glow. Nothing. I told myself it was my imagination. The forest was full of sounds, and I was just on edge. I forced myself to eat, though I barely tasted the food. Every few minutes, I looked up, expecting to see something standing just beyond the light. Then I heard it again, closer, a footstep, not an animal, not something four-legged, something walking. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, shining it into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating only the trunks of endless trees. My stomach twisted into knots. I wasn't alone. My mind raced. Had someone been following me? Was it another lost hiker? A hunter? My instincts screamed at me to put the fire out, to make myself invisible, but another part of me knew that whoever or whatever was out there already knew I was here. I held my breath, listening. Silence. The kind that was too perfect, too unnatural. Like the whole forest was holding its breath with me. Then, finally, another sound. A whisper. Not words. Not anything I could understand. Just the faintest sound of something exhaling in the dark. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire burning low and sat with my back to the rock, flashlight in hand, waiting. Every now and then, I'd hear another step, another shift of movement, but nothing ever came closer. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed my gear faster than I ever had in my life. My only goal was to move, to get out of there. I had no idea which way to go, but I knew staying put wasn't an option. I walked for hours, exhaustion weighing on me, until finally, I stumbled onto a familiar trail. Relief hit me so hard I almost collapsed. I followed it, not stopping until I reached my car. When I turned on my phone, I saw I had been missing for 2 days. I still don't know what happened. I still don't know who or what was out there with me. But I do know one thing. I'll never hike alone again. I set out early in the morning, just before sunrise. The trailhead was about an hour's drive from my house, deep in the mountains where cell service was non-existent. It wasn't my first time hiking alone, and I liked the solitude. No conversations, no distractions. Just me, the trail, and the sounds of the wild. The hike was supposed to be about 12 miles round trip, leading up to a ridge that overlooked the entire valley. I had checked the weather the night before. Clear skies, no rain, perfect conditions. I packed enough water, some snacks, my knife, a lighter, a small flashlight, and my GPS watch. Everything was set. The first few miles were easy. The trail was well marked, the dirt packed down from years of foot traffic. Birds called out in the trees, and I could hear the faint rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. Occasionally, I spotted deer tracks in the mud. Nothing unusual. About 5 miles in, the trail narrowed as it moved into denser forest. The trees closed in, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. I didn't mind. I'd been in deep woods before, but something felt different here. Subtle at first, like a quiet pressure in the air. I ignored it and pushed forward. An hour later, I reached a fork in the trail. My GPS watch told me to go left, but there was an old, unmarked path to the right. It looked unused, overgrown with weeds and fallen branches. My gut told me to stick to the planned route, so I took the left path. That's when things started to feel off. The further I walked, the quieter everything became. The birds had stopped singing. Even the wind seemed to die down. It was like stepping into a vacuum. My own footsteps sounded unnaturally loud on the dirt. Then I smelled something. Faint at first, but unmistakable, the metallic tang of blood. I stopped, scanning the trees. The smell grew stronger, and I spotted something just off the trail. A deer carcass. It had been torn apart, its ribs exposed, its insides a mess of dark red and white. But something wasn't right. The kill was fresh, but there were no signs of struggle. No tracks around it. No drag marks. It was just there, as if it had fallen apart on its own. I backed away and kept moving. I wasn't armed with a gun, just my knife, and that wouldn't do much against a predator. I didn't run. I knew better than that, but I walked faster, keeping my head on a swivel. Another mile in, I noticed something strange. The trees ahead looked wrong, like they had been twisted, their trunks bending unnaturally. The bark was stripped in places, exposing pale wood underneath. I stopped to examine one, running my fingers over the marks. They weren't claw marks, not from any animal I knew. They were long, deep, almost like scratches made by human fingernails. The feeling in my gut tightened. Something was off. I turned back the way I came, or at least I thought I did. After 20 minutes of walking, I should have been back at the deer carcass, but it was nowhere to be found. The trees looked the same, but nothing was familiar. I checked my GPS watch, but the screen was frozen, the signal lost. My pulse picked up. I wasn't lost. I knew I had followed the trail, and yet nothing looked right. I took a deep breath and forced myself to stay calm. Panicking wouldn't help. I took out my compass. It was spinning wildly. My hands tightened around it. Something was interfering with it. Then I heard it. A sound. Faint at first, like someone walking through the brush. Slow, deliberate. Not an animal. Too heavy. Too precise. I froze, listening. The steps stopped. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing. Just the dense, silent forest. Then, a branch snapped, closer this time. I wasn't alone. A wave of cold washed over me, the kind that makes your hair stand on end. I didn't call out. Something in me knew not to. I moved carefully, keeping my steps light. I wasn't running, but I wasn't staying either. The feeling of being watched was unbearable now, like eyes pressing into the back of my skull. Another sound. A sharp, deliberate inhale, like someone sucking in air through their teeth. I didn't look. Couldn't. I walked faster. My heart hammered against my ribs. I focused on the ground, on the trail, on getting out. Then I saw it. The fork in the trail. Relief flooded me. I had made it back. I didn't stop. I didn't question it. I took the familiar path and moved as fast as I could without running. The silence followed me. The air was still suffocating. It wasn't until I was 2 miles from the trailhead that I finally heard birds again. The moment I did, I nearly collapsed with relief. The pressure in the air lifted. The forest was normal again. I made it back to my car and locked the doors, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I never looked back. When I checked my GPS watch later, the recorded route made no sense. It showed me going in circles, looping back on myself in impossible ways. I don't know what was out there. I don't want to know, but I'll never hike that trail again. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A solo hike through the deep forests of the Pacific Northwest, Just me, my backpack, and miles of untouched wilderness. I had done plenty of solo hikes before, but this was my longest yet. A 5-day trek through rugged terrain, away from the crowds, away from everything. I wanted the challenge, the solitude, the feeling of being completely alone with nature. The first day was smooth. I started early in the morning, the air crisp and cool, the kind that makes you feel alive. My pack was heavy, but I had trained for this. My boots crunched against the dirt path as I weaved through towering pines, their scent filling the air. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. No cars, no voices, just the wind through the trees and the occasional distant bird call. By mid-afternoon, I reached a stream where I refilled my water bottle, filtering it carefully before drinking. I had planned my route meticulously, marking spots where I could find water and possible places to set up camp. The spot I had in mind for the first night was about 2 miles ahead, near a small clearing. I kept moving, making good time, the sun starting to dip behind the mountains. As I neared my camping spot, something felt off. The air was still, too still, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just tired, maybe a little on edge from being alone. I set up my tent, cooked a quick meal over my small stove, and sat by the fire for a while, watching the flames dance. That's when I noticed it. A sound, faint but there. A soft rustling, not the kind the wind makes, but the kind something moving through the underbrush makes. I stopped chewing, holding my breath, listening. My eyes scanned the dark tree line, but I saw nothing. Could have been a deer, could have been anything, but it didn't stop. The rustling would come and go, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. I told myself it was an animal. I forced myself to believe that. I climbed into my tent, zipped myself in, and tried to sleep. Every little noise outside kept me awake. A twig snapping, leaves crunching. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, but nothing ever came close. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. The second day, I told myself I was being paranoid. There were animals out here. It was normal to hear things. I packed up camp and moved on, heading deeper into the wilderness. The trail became rougher, the trees denser. The farther I went, the less traveled it felt. I saw no signs of other hikers, no footprints, no old campfires, nothing. That evening, I found a good spot near another stream. As I set up camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was ridiculous, but the hairs on my arms stood on end. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees, but again, nothing was there. The forest was playing tricks on me. It had to be. That night was worse. The noises started again, this time closer, more deliberate. Footsteps, not just rustling. Slow, careful steps. I lay in my tent, gripping my knife, heart hammering. I listened for hours, waiting for something to happen, but nothing ever did. Eventually, the sounds stopped, and I passed out from sheer exhaustion. By the third day, I was starting to feel real fear. I wasn't imagining this. Something was out there. Something was following me. I considered turning back, but I was already more than halfway through the loop. It would take just as long to go back as it would to keep going. I told myself I was being foolish. I had everything I needed to protect myself, my knife, my bear spray. Whatever was out there, it was probably just an animal. I pushed on. But as the day went on, I started to notice things. Small things. The way the birds would suddenly stop singing. The way the woods would go dead silent at random moments. Then there were the tracks. I wasn't an expert tracker, but I knew enough to recognize boot prints. Fresh ones. And they weren't mine. Panic crept up my spine. There wasn't supposed to be anyone out here. I had checked the permits before coming. This was a remote trail, and no one else had registered for it this week. Yet someone had been walking this trail and not long before me. I picked up my pace. My whole body was on edge. Every sound made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there, but I never did. That night, I didn't set up a fire. I found a spot far off the trail, hidden among thick trees, and set up my tent as quietly as possible. I ate a cold meal, barely tasting it, and climbed into my sleeping bag. I didn't sleep. Not really. I lay there listening. Then I heard it, breathing, right outside my tent. Slow, deep. I stopped breathing myself, every muscle in my body tensing. The fabric of the tent was thin. I could hear everything. The breathing was steady, controlled, not like an animal sniffing around. It was human.
My kniffe was in my hand.
I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Minutes passed. The breathing continued. Then, footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling my tent. I wanted to scream, to run, but I forced myself to stay still. Whoever it was, they were waiting for something, testing me, seeing if I would come out. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The footsteps faded away into the trees. The breathing disappeared. I stayed awake the entire night, gripping my knife until my hand ached. At first light, I packed up and moved as fast as I could. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just needed to get out. I hiked for hours without stopping, barely drinking, barely eating. My legs burned, but I didn't slow down. By late afternoon, I finally saw something that made my heart nearly burst from my chest. A trail marker, an actual sign. I was close to the exit. I kept moving. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. When I finally reached the trailhead, I nearly collapsed. My car was there, right where I had left it. I threw my pack inside, locked the doors, and sped away, not looking in the rearview mirror. I never reported it. What would I say? That I heard footsteps? That someone breathed outside my tent? There was no proof, no evidence. Just a deep, gut-wrenching feeling that if I had made one wrong move, I wouldn't have made it out of those woods alive. I haven't gone on a solo hike since. The plan was simple. A solo, 3-day hike through the backcountry. I had done plenty of solo hikes before, always careful, always prepared. This one was supposed to be no different. I parked my truck at the trailhead early in the morning. It was mid-September, the kind of season where the woods were cool and quiet, where summer's energy had faded and everything felt still. My pack was heavy with supplies, enough food, water, and gear to last. I had mapped out my route carefully, a loop through the thick woods that would take me past a few small lakes before bringing me back around to the truck. The first day was uneventful. I walked for hours, following the narrow dirt path that wound through dense trees. The only sounds were my boots on the ground, the occasional rustle of small animals, and the distant chirp of birds. The deeper I went, the less I saw signs of other people. No footprints in the dirt, no wrappers left behind, no signs of campers. That was fine with me. I liked the isolation. By late afternoon, I reached the first lake on my route, a small body of water with a rocky shore. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in muted oranges and blues. I set up my tent a few yards from the water, built a small fire, and cooked a simple meal. The night was silent, except for the occasional splash of fish in the lake. I went to bed early, lulled by the stillness. The second day, the feeling started. It wasn't immediate, but sometime after midday, as I made my way through an area of thicker trees, something shifted. At first, it was just a prickling sensation, the kind you get when you feel like someone is watching you. I stopped, turned around, and saw nothing but trees. No movement, no sound. I kept walking, but the feeling didn't go away. I started noticing little things. The woods were quieter than they should have been. No birds, no wind through the trees, just silence. And then, the subtle signs that I wasn't alone. Twigs snapping behind me, soft enough that I almost thought I imagined it. The occasional shift in the underbrush, just at the edge of my vision. Every time I stopped to listen, there was nothing. I told myself it was animals. A deer maybe, a fox, something harmless. But by late afternoon, I wasn't so sure. I reached the second lake and set up camp, but my nerves were on edge. I kept scanning the trees, expecting to see something, anything, out of place. I tried to eat, but my stomach was too tight with unease. The night was worse. I lay in my tent, listening. Every time I started to drift off, something pulled me back. A soft rustling, a faint snap of a branch. Not close, but not far. The worst part was that it never sounded like it was coming from just one place. It was as if whatever was out there was circling me, keeping its distance but never leaving. At some point, exhaustion won, and I finally fell asleep. But when I woke up, something was wrong. My pack, which I had left zipped up and secured, was open. Some of my gear was scattered. A few protein bars missing, my water bottle moved a few feet away. No signs of animals. No scratch marks, no torn fabric. Just moved. That was enough. I decided to cut my trip short and head back. I packed up as fast as I could, moving with a sense of urgency I hadn't felt before. I told myself I was being paranoid, that there was a logical explanation. Maybe I had been careless with my pack. Maybe I was imagining things. But as I started the hike back, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The entire hike, I felt it. Presence. Something moving when I moved, stopping when I stopped. I started glancing over my shoulder more often, but I never saw anything, until I did. It was late afternoon, the light starting to fade. I was maybe 5 miles from the trailhead when I saw it. A figure. Not clearly, not enough to make out details, but just enough to know it was there. A shape standing between the trees, too far to see a face, too still to be an animal. My heart pounded, and I forced myself to keep walking, to not run. Running would make it worse. I picked up my pace, my breath shallow, every instinct screaming at me to move faster. But every time I looked back, the figure was gone. The last mile was the worst. I could feel it closer now. The sun was almost gone, the woods dark, the path barely visible. I forced myself to stay steady, to keep going. And then, just when I thought I might not make it, I saw the break in the trees. The trailhead. My truck. I ran the last few yards, yanking open the door and throwing myself inside, locking it without thinking. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. The headlights illuminated the trees ahead, and for a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw something move at the edge of the light. I didn't stay to look. I pulled out fast, gravel kicking up behind me as I sped down the road, not slowing down until I was miles away. I never went back to that trail. I still hike, but not alone. Never alone. I started my hike just after sunrise, the air crisp and cool as I set out on a remote trail deep in the national forest. I had planned this trip for months. 3 days of solitude, just me, my backpack, and miles of untouched wilderness. The trail wasn't well known, which was exactly what I wanted. No crowds, no distractions, just the rhythmic crunch of my boots on dirt and the steady breathing of my own body. The first few hours passed peacefully. The path wound through towering pines, the occasional shaft of sunlight breaking through the canopy. I took in the smell of damp earth and listened to the distant calls of birds. It was perfect. I had always loved hiking alone. It made me feel untethered, completely free. The farther I got from civilization, the more at peace I felt. Around midday, I stopped by a creek to eat and refill my water. I sat on a flat rock, enjoying the sound of rushing water as I chewed on my sandwich. As I looked around, I realized how truly alone I was. No other hikers, no distant hum of cars, nothing but the whisper of wind through the trees. It was a rare kind of quiet. After lunch, I continued hiking, my pack feeling heavier with each mile. The terrain became rougher, the incline steeper. The trees grew denser, their thick trunks blotting out the sun. The temperature dropped slightly, making the air feel damp. I checked my map and compass often, making sure I was still on course. There was no cell service out here, but I had my GPS as a backup. Still, I preferred navigating the old-fashioned way. As afternoon wore on, I came across an old, unmarked trail branching off from the main path. It wasn't on my map. Overgrown and narrow, it looked like it hadn't been used in years. Curiosity got the best of me. I figured it might lead to an interesting viewpoint or an old campsite. I made a mental note of where I was and stepped onto the path. It was slow going. The underbrush was thick, thorns snagging my pants. Branches hung low, forcing me to duck every few steps. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to change. The air felt heavier, the sounds of birds and insects fading. I felt an odd pressure in my chest, like I was walking into something I wasn't supposed to see. I pushed on. The trail twisted and narrowed until it barely looked like a path at all. Then, I saw something ahead, something unnatural. Pile of bones. At first, I thought it was just an animal carcass, but as I got closer, I realized they were arranged. Neatly stacked, ribs on one side, leg bones on another. The skull sat on top, empty eye sockets staring at nothing. I froze. My breath came faster. The bones were bleached white, old, but not ancient. I scanned the ground for footprints. There were none, at least none I could see. My heart pounded. Maybe some hunter had done this? But why? Why arrange them like that? And who had been out here recently enough for the bones to still be here? I didn't wait to find out. I turned back the way I came, moving faster, ignoring the thorns scraping my arms. I just needed to get back to the main trail. Every rustle in the underbrush made my nerves spike. I had felt fine being alone all day, but now I was aware of how vulnerable I really was. I made it back to the main trail, my pulse still racing. I kept walking, pushing myself to put distance between me and that place. The sun was starting to dip lower, casting long shadows. I needed to find a spot to set up camp, but I didn't want to stop just yet. My gut told me to keep moving. By the time I finally stopped, I had covered more ground than I planned. I found a small clearing, flat enough for my tent. As I set up camp, I kept looking around, half expecting to see someone watching from the trees. But there was no one, just me, the wind, and the distant hoot of an owl. That night, I barely slept. Every snap of a twig sent my heart into my throat. I kept my knife close, my flashlight within reach. At some point, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a restless sleep. Morning came slow. My body ached from tossing and turning. I packed up quickly, eager to keep moving. I wanted to put as much distance as possible between me and that pile of bones. The plan had been to hike deeper into the wilderness, but now all I wanted was to get back to my car. By midday, I felt a little calmer. I convinced myself the bones had just been from some weird hunter or an old ritual site. Nothing sinister. But then, I noticed something that made my blood go cold. A footprint. Fresh. Not mine. It was right there on the trail, slightly ahead of me. A heavy boot print, deep in the dirt. Someone else was out here, and they weren't far. I slowed my pace, listening. The forest felt wrong again. Too quiet. I strained to hear anything. Footsteps, breathing, movement. But there was nothing. I kept walking, my muscles tight. Then, I saw another footprint, and another, leading off the trail. I didn't follow. I just kept moving faster now. I forced myself not to run. Running would only make noise, and I didn't want to sound like prey. An hour passed. Then, too, I started to relax, convincing myself I was alone again. And then I saw it. A campsite, but not mine. It was just off the trail, hidden between thick trees. A small, old tent sagging in the middle. A fire pit, long dead. An old metal pot, rusted over. It looked abandoned, but something felt off. There were no leaves or debris inside the tent, like someone had used it recently. I stepped closer. The ground near the tent was disturbed, like someone had been pacing. Then I saw it, a small pile of bones near the fire pit. Not animal bones this time. Human. My stomach turned. I didn't think. I just moved. Fast. Back on the trail, pushing myself to hike faster than I ever had. I didn't look back. By the time I reached my car, the sun was setting. I locked the doors the second I got inside, my hands shaking as I started the engine. I drove until I had cell service, then pulled over and called the authorities. They found the campsite. They found the bones. But they didn't find anyone else. No footprints. No recent activity. Just the remains of something or someone long forgotten. I haven't been back since, and I never will. I always thought I was experienced enough to hike alone, I had done countless solo trips before, carrying only the essentials: water, a knife, a small first aid kit, and a well-worn map. I trusted myself. That's why, when I picked an isolated trail in the mountains of Montana, I didn't think twice. I wanted solitude. I wanted to get away from the constant buzz of the world. The trail was deep in the wilderness, a place where cell service dropped off within an hour, and the only way out was back the way you came. I had planned for a 2-day hike with enough supplies to last me 3, just in case. The first day was perfect. The weather was cool but not cold, and the trail was quiet except for the occasional rustling of wind through the trees. I followed the map carefully, making sure I was on the right path. I had chosen a loop trail, about 15 miles in total, cutting through dense forests and past a few small lakes. My goal was to camp halfway through, wake up early, and finish the hike by midday the next day. I made good time, stopping only to eat a quick meal and refill my water at a clear stream. As the sun dipped low, I found a decent spot near a rock outcropping, away from the trail but not too deep in the woods. I set up my small tent, made a quick fire, and cooked a simple meal. The silence was comforting. I liked the quiet, but that night I didn't sleep well. It wasn't the cold or the discomfort. I had camped in worse conditions before. It was something else. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt watched. I tried to shake the feeling, reminding myself that I was alone. That's why I came out here, to be alone. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up abruptly. My body felt tense, alert. The fire had burned down to embers, casting weak red light around my campsite. I listened. Nothing, just the wind in the trees. Still, something didn't feel right. I unzipped my tent as quietly as I could and stepped out, scanning the darkness. The firelight barely reached the trees. Beyond that, it was pitch black. I stood there for a long time, straining my ears. Nothing, just my paranoia, I told myself. Still, I kept my knife close as I crawled back into my tent. It took me a long time to fall asleep again. I woke up with the sun. Everything felt normal again. The tension from the night before seemed ridiculous in the daylight. I packed up my things, had a quick breakfast, and started hiking again. The second day was harder. The terrain was rougher, the incline steeper. My legs burned as I climbed over rocky hillsides, my boots slipping on loose dirt. By midday, I was exhausted but still on track. I checked my map at every turn, making sure I was following the trail. Then, around the afternoon, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A footprint. It wasn't mine. It was fresh, pressed deep into the dirt. Someone else had walked this trail recently. That shouldn't have been strange. This was a public hiking trail, after all. But it was the shape of the footprint that bothered me. It was barefoot. No tread marks, no boot print. Just the clear outline of toes and a heel. A human footprint. And it wasn't old. I stared at it for a long time. It was too cold to be walking barefoot out here. Even in the summer, the forest floor was rough, littered with sharp rocks and roots. I glanced around, suddenly feeling that eerie sense of being watched again. The trees swayed gently in the wind. The trail was empty. I shook my head and kept walking, forcing myself to ignore it. Maybe someone had just taken their boots off for a moment. Maybe I was overthinking it. But a few minutes later, I saw another one, and then another. I stopped. My heart was hammering now. The footprints were following the trail, and they were heading in the same direction as me. I tried to stay calm, but my body was reacting on its own. My skin prickling, my breath coming shorter. I kept walking, but my senses were on high alert. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. Then I saw it. Ahead on the trail, about 30 feet away, something was crouched near the ground. Person. They were hunched over, their hands pressed into the dirt, their head tilted down. Long, tangled hair covered their face. Their clothes, or what was left of them, were shredded and filthy. I stopped dead in my tracks. For a moment, they didn't move, just crouched there, still as stone. Then, slowly, their head lifted, and they looked at me. Their eyes were sunken, wild. Their skin was stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. Their mouth hung slightly open, lips cracked and dry. couldn't move. My body refused. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but I was frozen in place. Then, without a sound, they stood up. They were tall, too tall. Their limbs were long, unnaturally thin. They took a step toward me. That's when my body finally obeyed. I turned and ran. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I just ran, my legs burning, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The trail blurred past me, trees whipping by in my peripheral vision. I didn't dare look back. Couldn't. I ran until my chest ached, until my legs nearly gave out beneath me. Finally, I saw something through the trees, a road, the end of the trail. I stumbled onto the gravel, nearly collapsing. My car was still there, parked where I left it. My hands fumbled with the keys, shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I threw myself inside, slammed the lock, and just sat there, panting, staring back at the trail. Nothing. The forest was still, empty. I don't know how long I sat there before I finally started the engine and drove away. I never reported what I saw. What could I even say? That I saw a barefoot, half-starved person in the woods? That they looked wrong, like something stretched too thin? I don't know who or what they were. Maybe just a lost hiker. Maybe something worse. I only know one thing. I'll never hike alone again. I don't know how long I was out there, but it was longer than I meant to be. I'd planned for a solo hike, nothing too intense, just a few days in the backcountry. I packed light but smart enough food, a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag, a water filter, and a solid first aid kit. I had done hikes like this before, but never alone for this long. I figured it was something I should do at least once in my life. The trail started out easy, winding through the trees, the smell of pine thick in the air. Felt good, peaceful even. The crunch of my boots on the dirt, the distant sound of birds. It was the kind of quiet that's hard to find anywhere else. By the second day, I was deep into the mountains. I hadn't seen anyone since the first afternoon. It was just me and the trees, the wind, and the distant trickle of a stream. I had a map and a compass, and I knew how to use them. I had checked the weather, and there was no rain in the forecast. Everything was going according to plan. That night, I set up camp near a small clearing. I was exhausted but satisfied. After eating, I sat by my small fire and just listened to the silence. It was colder than I expected, so I crawled into my sleeping bag early. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. First, I didn't know why. The fire had burned down to embers, and the night was still. No wind, no rustling leaves, just silence. Then I heard it, a single snap like a branch breaking. I held my breath. Probably just an animal, I told myself. A deer or something. I listened, waiting for more movement, but there was nothing. After a few minutes, I let myself relax. It was just my nerves. Morning came, and everything seemed normal again. I packed up and kept moving. The hike was harder that day, more uphill stretches, more loose rock. My legs burned, and my pack felt heavier than before. At some point in the afternoon, I noticed something off. I should have hit a fork in the trail by now, but there was no sign of it. I pulled out my map and tried to figure out where I'd gone wrong. Maybe I had passed it without noticing, but that didn't make sense. I'd been paying attention. I turned back, retracing my steps for a while, but nothing looked familiar. I told myself not to panic. I wasn't lost, just off course. I could find my way back. I had the map and I had my compass. The sun was still high in the sky. I had time, but the longer I walked, the worse the feeling got. Something wasn't right. I was moving, but I wasn't getting anywhere. Then I saw it. My own boot print, fresh in the dirt. I stopped cold. My heart pounded in my chest. I had just walked in a full circle. That shouldn't have been possible. I had been following my compass, keeping a straight line. I swallowed hard and tried again. This time, I forced myself to pay extra attention to landmarks. I picked a tall, dead tree in the distance and walked straight for it. Then I picked another one, keeping my direction. I had to be making progress now. But then, an hour later, I saw the same damn boot print. The same exact spot. That's when I started to panic. I didn't get lost. I wasn't careless. But somehow I was walking in circles. I sat down, tried to breathe. My body was exhausted. My legs felt heavy. But I couldn't stop now. I had to get out. I tried again. I picked a direction and pushed through, moving faster, ignoring my aching muscles. The sun started sinking lower, and my stomach twisted at the thought of another night out here. Then, as I was moving through the trees, I spotted something ahead, something that made my blood run cold. A campsite. First, I thought it was mine, that I had somehow looped back again. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The tent was there, but it wasn't mine. It was older, dirtier, like it had been abandoned for a long time. The fire pit was full of ash. The rocks blackened. I called out, but no one answered. I stepped closer, my heart hammering. The tent was partially unzipped, and when I looked inside, my breath caught in my throat. There was a sleeping bag, unzipped, covered in dirt. A backpack, torn open, its contents scattered. And next to it, a boot, just one. Old, weathered, but still upright, like someone had left in a hurry. No signs of an animal attack. No blood, just abandoned. I backed away. My hands were shaking. I had to leave. Now, I turned and walked as fast as I could, forcing my body forward even though every muscle screamed at me to stop. And then, finally, I saw something I recognized. A ridge, a rock formation I had passed earlier that morning. I had found my way back. I didn't stop. I kept moving until the trees started thinning, until I saw the dirt road where my car was parked. When I finally reached it, I collapsed against the hood, gasping for air. I looked back at the tree line, at the place I had just escaped. It was empty, silent. I don't know what happened out there. I don't know how I got turned around, or why I found that campsite. But I do know one thing. I'll never go back. I had been hiking for years, always looking for new trails, new challenges, new places where I could get lost in the quiet. It was never about the adventure, not for me. I liked the stillness, the way the world felt far away when I was deep in the woods. That's why I picked this trail, one I had never heard of before. It was in a national forest off the main routes, a little out of the way. A friend mentioned it in passing, said he tried it once and didn't like it, something about the feeling of being watched. He wasn't the type to get spooked, so I figured he must have been having a bad day. I didn't think twice about it. I left early in the morning, parked at a small, unmarked lot, and started walking. The air was cool, damp from rain the night before. The trail wasn't well maintained, but that didn't bother me. It made it feel untouched, like I was the first one to set foot here in a long time. I liked that. A few miles in, the trees thickened. The light struggled to break through the canopy, giving everything a muted, greenish hue. The only sounds were my own footsteps and the occasional rustling of leaves from some small animal. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. The kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. That was the first thing I noticed. The stillness. Like the forest was holding its breath. I kept walking. The trail dipped into a small ravine, and I had to navigate around some fallen trees. I checked my map. No mention of the ravine, but maps aren't always perfect. I climbed over a rotting log, the wood crumbling under my hands, and kept going. The trail should have curved back up, but it didn't. It just kept going down. I followed it, assuming it would loop back at some point. After another half mile, I realized something was off. The trees looked the same, too much the same, like I was walking in circles, but I knew I wasn't. I checked my compass. The needle spun lazily before settling in a direction that didn't feel right. I turned back, deciding I had gone far enough. That's when I heard it. A soft, distant thump, like something heavy dropping onto the forest floor. I stopped, listened. Nothing, just my own breathing. I kept walking, moving faster now. The silence pressed against my ears. Then another thump. Closer. I didn't stop this time. I walked quickly, trying to find the way I came, but the path looked wrong. The trees were too thick, the underbrush too tangled. I pulled out my GPS, but it wouldn't lock onto a signal. My phone showed no service. Not unusual, but still not great. I kept moving. My steps felt too loud. Every time my boot hit the ground, it echoed. The air was heavy, like I was walking through something thick and unseen. Then I saw it. A tree. A massive oak with a deep, dark scar running down its trunk. I had seen it before. I was sure of it, but I had been walking in a straight line. How could I have looped back? I heard another sound. Not a thump this time. A crack, like a branch breaking underfoot. But not mine. I wasn't moving. It was close. Too close. I turned sharply, scanning the trees. Nothing. Just thick trunks and shadows. My breathing was too fast now, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. I wasn't alone. I didn't know how I knew it, but I did. Something was out there, watching, following. I forced myself to keep moving. My legs were stiff, heavy. My body wanted to freeze, but I didn't let it. I needed to get out. The path sloped up, and I pushed forward, lungs burning. The trees thinned, and I saw a glimpse of open sky. I was almost there. Then the smell hit me, rot, thick and wet, like something long dead. My stomach turned. I didn't stop. I didn't look. I just kept going. I reached the crest of the hill, and there it was, my car, right where I left it. But I didn't feel relief. Not yet. I fumbled for my keys, got the door open, and slid inside, locking it immediately. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I sat there for a second, trying to catch my breath. Then I looked up. Across the lot, just at the tree line, something moved. A shape, tall, still, watching. I didn't wait to see what it was. I threw the car into reverse, tires kicking up gravel, and sped down the dirt road without looking back. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the highway, surrounded by cars and noise and everything that felt normal. I never went back to that trail. Never looked it up. I don't want to know what I saw or what saw me. I started early in the morning, well before the sun came up. I wanted to beat the heat and have enough time to make it back before dark. The trail was supposed to be a loop, 15 miles of rugged backcountry, no cell service, and no easy way out. I had read about it online, studied the topographic maps, and packed accordingly. Extra water, a first aid kit, a GPS, a paper map, and a knife. I even carried a small emergency bivvy just in case something went wrong. The first few miles were easy. The air was crisp, the forest still damp from last night's rain. The trail wound through thick pines, the scent of earth and wet leaves filling my nose. I moved fast, my boots crunching against loose dirt and fallen pine needles. The only sounds were my breathing and the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Around the 5-mile mark, I stopped for a break. I took a sip of water, stretched my legs, and checked my GPS. Everything looked good. No reason to be worried. The elevation gain wasn't as bad as I thought it would be, and the trail was well marked. I had read warnings online about people getting lost, but I felt confident. I knew how to navigate, and I had multiple ways to track my location. After another hour, the landscape began to change. The trees thinned, replaced by dry, scraggly bushes and loose rock. The sun was higher now, and I could feel the heat creeping in. I wiped the sweat off my forehead and kept moving. The trail was narrower here, hugging the side of a steep incline. I could see for miles in one direction, rolling hills, deep valleys, and distant peaks. It was beautiful, but in the other direction, there was nothing but a sheer drop. If I slipped, there wouldn't be anything to stop me from tumbling hundreds of feet down. That's when I noticed something odd. A footprint. It was fresh. Too fresh. The dirt was still loose around the edges. Someone else was out here. That wasn't unusual. This was a public trail. But something about it made me uneasy. It was just one print. I scanned the area but didn't see any others. Just that single, solitary mark in the dirt. I shook it off and kept going. My mind was playing tricks on me. People hiked out here all the time. I had probably just missed the other prints. The trail grew harder. The incline was steeper now, and the ground was loose, shifting under my weight. I had to slow down, planting each step carefully. My legs burned, but I kept going. The GPS said I was still on track. Then I saw another footprint. This one was different, larger, deeper, like someone had put their full weight into it. I crouched down, examining it closely. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't the same as the first one I saw. There were no treads, no boot marks, just the outline of a bare foot pressed into the dirt. I looked around again. I was alone. No sounds except the wind and the occasional chirp of a bird. No movement in the distance, just open wilderness. I swallowed hard and stood up. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe someone had come through here barefoot. It didn't make sense, but people did weird things sometimes. I had read stories about ultralight hikers who didn't wear shoes. Maybe it was one of them. I pressed on. But now my pace was slower, more careful. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The further I went, the less sure I was of my surroundings. The bushes seemed denser, the shadows darker. Every time the wind shifted, I swore I heard something. Not an animal, not the normal rustling of the woods. Something else. I checked my GPS again. I was still on the right path, but the trail ahead looked different than what I expected. Narrower, harder to follow. The ground here was drier, the rocks looser. I took a few steps forward, then stopped. Another footprint. This one was different again. Not a bare foot, a shoe, but not a hiking boot, a sneaker, and it was facing the opposite direction, as if whoever made it had turned around right here. That's when I realized something. There were no footprints ahead of me, just behind me, and all of them were different. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. Someone else was out here, more than one person, and they weren't following the trail. I turned slowly, scanning the ridgeline. Nothing, but I knew better than to trust my eyes. The landscape had too many places to hide. I picked up my pace. My goal now wasn't to finish the loop, it was to get back. I checked my map and found an alternate route, a shortcut that would shave off 2 miles. It was steeper, but I didn't care. I just wanted to be off this mountain. The sun was lower now, dipping behind the peaks. The shadows stretched longer. I moved quickly, but the faster I went, the harder it was to keep my footing. I slipped once, catching myself on a jagged rock. My palm stung, but I didn't stop. Then I heard it, a rock tumbling, somewhere behind me. I didn't look back. I forced myself forward, my legs burning, my lungs aching. I reached the junction where the shortcut met the main trail. Just a few more miles. That's when I saw it. A single water bottle, sitting upright in the middle of the trail. Not old, not weathered, full, placed there, waiting. I didn't stop. I didn't think. I ran. I don't remember the last few miles. Just my heartbeat pounding in my ears, my vision tunneling as I pushed forward. When I finally saw my car, I didn't stop until I was inside, the doors locked, my breath ragged. I sat there for a long time, staring at the trailhead, waiting to see if anyone would emerge. No one did. I never reported it, never told anyone. I still don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I know this: I was not alone.